Do you think that we should do a little intro? Like last time we didn't do any kind of...
Yeah, I think we should do an intro, especially since we have a guest,
Yeah.
so that'll be awesome. Hey, you're our first guest.
You're our first
Yay.
On our second podcast with not even the same people as before.
I know. It's okay. It's fine.
Yeah.
So who all was in the first one?
It was us and then Sean also was there.
Okay.
Yeah, that's kind of like the main group, but it's going to vary a lot depending on who's available, and then we're going to do solo content too, so assuming all goes well.
Have you edited the first one at all?
A little bit. I haven't had much time though, just because I have a lot of homework right now.
Yeah.
But this next week, I should have a lot more time. So
Sweet.
I'm wanting to get all that up and
Awesome.
yeah, cut out the stuff we don't want in it,
Yeah.
post the big one, and then as well as sections.
Nice. Are you specifically thinking of on YouTube, or are we going to try to make the other podcast accounts that are required for whatever that business entails?
So what, like Facebook?
Getting it onto like the Apple and then
Right.
like Spotify and Android ones.
I think we should just start with YouTube,
Okay.
and then once we've kind of, because like we're just trying to figure out our own shit and
Yeah.
kinks right now. So
True.
once we've got like a good rhythm and we're getting stuff up and we're a little more organized about it and have like something to stand on, then I think we'll do the other stuff.
That makes sense.
Still in the practice runs right now.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah.
Yeah. Is it recording?
It is, yeah.
Oh, then here we are. Perfect.
Motherfucker.
We're on the mic.
3, 2, 1.
Yeah, come on.
No.
Where's the count?
No, it has to be natural flow into it.
All right,
Because
so
last time we had so many freaking like conversations
That's true.
beforehand that
I
we were
know.
like, damn it, that would have been nice.
It
to
would have been
have.
sweet to have the X-Men conversation. We were talking
yeah,
about,
that
like,
was cool.
Magneto and like his motivations and versus Xavier and stuff like that, and how interesting their dichotomies are.
They have one of the coolest like villain
Oh, yeah.
hero relationships.
For sure.
Dude, yeah, frenemies thing going on. I love that shit. Yeah, those new ones with the young actors are the best. I love the dynamics there.
I think they did a pretty good job capturing it in the old ones too.
They
I
do,
mean,
but they
got-
definitely dive further into it since they got to do like the how they met and
That's
then the
true.
falling out and
That's true.
yeah.
It's just like the actors that they got, like Ian McKellen,
Ian
and,
So
McKellen
good.
and Patrick
Sir Patrick Stewart.
Yeah.
Like just they, especially I can't remember which one it is, but the one where Xavier like visits him in prison. I
Oh,
liked
yeah.
those
Those
scenes
two,
a lot.
I think.
Playing chess and stuff.
Yeah,
Yeah.
that was so awesome.
We
Hello,
rips
old
the
friend.
iron. Rips the iron out of that guy's blood.
Oh yeah, that was
Oh,
intense.
Jesus.
And then like makes a little disc that he can float on with
Yeah.
little things that he just that was great. Good times.
Terrifying.
Seriously.
You just do that anytime he wants. So cool.
Wait, what? The metal in their blood?
Well-
No, I just mean that like he has the ability to do that.
Yeah.
Like just like create. If he just has like a block of it, he just be like bloop, and
Oh,
now
yeah.
I'm flying, and I have bullets that I can just get back all the time. Like
Yeah.
You should really wear like armor. Can
That's
you
what
imagine
he-
the utility of having
Yeah.
just a suit of metal on all the
That's a
time?
good
I
point.
mean the traditional Magneto more in the comics. He's
Yeah.
always got the full breastplate. and the-
Oh, really?
Yeah.
I know he's got the helmet, but I didn't know he had a
Yeah.
breastplate.
Yeah,
and shit.
usually he's got a big red breastplate.
That's
that he wears.
awesome.
It's like got the pectoral muscles.
Yeah,
Abs cutting
reaching
through it.
kind of thing.
but
going
don't
on.
forget the cape.
Gotta have that cape, man.
Yes.
Gotta have that cape.
It was pretty sweet when he got the cape.
Dude, if you were that powerful, you'd wear. I mean, you'd do whatever the fuck you want. Like,
Exactly.
just be like, I'm gonna wear whatever the fuck I want.
I'd make a metal cape and then I'd use it
Yeah.
to like cut people's heads
There you
off
go.
and shit.
It's like a gold cape. So
Yeah.
it could be like only a few atoms thick. It could actually like flow in the wind.
But gold isn't magnetic.
Oh, that's true.
Idiot.
Yeah.
When did they do
True.
anything with that?
That's a good question. Probably because it's expensive and there's other metals that, well, they
Well, I'm
they
just
didn't want to
wondering- yeah.
confuse people and be
Exactly.
like, this metal isn't magnetic, you know, so.
Yeah, why, actually make it, I don't know, like so that he wasn't all powerful.
I know.
Yeah.
Well, in the comics, he can manipulate magnetic fields to the point where he can like bend light and crazy shit, I think.
Yeah, I was watching a thing about
That's
the
great.
shit in the comics, and
Uh-huh.
I mean, it gets to like
yeah.
absurd levels
Yeah.
of
It
power.
really does.
Yeah.
Yeah.
That's
I mean,
how it
at that
is.
point, you could manipulate the motion of any atom because your magnetic field's strong enough. Like,
Does it,
Full
Broken.
electrons now.
yeah, exactly.
he just like knows all of the magnetic fields too, somehow, because he can sense all of them.
You learn eventually, I'm sure.
I'm just like,
Focus on
Xavier
your
has to
feelings.
sit, yeah, exactly. No, that's what I mean. Xavier has to sit in this like amplified zone so he can like, go anywhere on the earth to be able to like read someone's mind. I'm pretty sure it's pretty chaotic to look at all the fucking magnetic fields that are happening all the time.
He doesn't necessarily need to look at them. He's just making his own to do things.
Yeah.
And so he could kind of do it by trial and error, you know.
Oh, real,
Kind of be
real.
like, what if I made a field over there? And then, oh, everything flies that way.
Yeah.
I bet that's exactly how his thoughts go.
Herp and derp.
Like,
No
there's, like,
wonder.
chilling in, like, a valley somewhere being like, maybe I could do this. I want to see a contemplative Magneto. Yikes. I feel like he's always just trying to tear shit up all the time, and it's like...
For real.
Dude, yeah. I mean, he had to deal with Nazi Germany.
I know, I was going to say,
Come
growing up
on.
in the Holocaust,
God.
like, god damn.
If
The
anything's gonna
beginning-
scar you, like, there's
Was-
some trauma there.
Right?
That was, like, the beginning of 2, I think, of
They
the
showed that
of when
scene
he's a
where
kid.
ripped from his mother and he
Yeah,
pulls the gates.
and then they
Yeah.
kill his mom in front of him.
Dude,
and-
that
That was in the first one. That was in the first of the new ones. Actually.
Oh, okay,
Yeah.
okay.
Yeah.
Well, they reshowed it.
Yeah, that's
Oh,
what I
yeah.
thought. Yeah, because they did, I think, have him break it, like, bending
In
it.
the
And then
game,
they
yeah.
went into, like, yeah, what's his face?
Right, they had the actual aftermath of that, where he's in
Yeah.
the office and freaking out and
Yeah.
all that.
Move the
Right.
coin.
Yeah.
God, that was a good
Dude, when he
scene.
crushes the helmets on the soldiers' heads after that, oh my
It
god.
just goes super crazy,
Just
man.
starts, and they're like, oh,
Yeah,
God.
and that one dude's just laughing. What is that guy's name?
Oh, Kevin Bacon.
Yeah.
Yeah.
But what's his character's name?
Oh,
Shaw.
Shaw,
Yeah.
Mm.
Richard Shaw.
Can I just say, how funny is it that a dude named Kevin Bacon kind of has a pig nose?
You're like,
That's just not fair.
suck it on the Kevin Bacon.
That poor guy.
Yeah, but he was in Footloose, so he's kind of gonna win forever.
And, I mean, he seems to have won.
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Doing pretty good, I
He
guess.
made it work for him.
I mean,
I like
his
it.
name is probably bigger than his like career in a lot of ways. Because like, you
Yeah.
ever heard of like the 6 degrees in Kevin Bacon and stuff? But, like,
Is that a thing, really?
yeah, like it's the idea that like you know everyone by 6 degrees
Right.
of separation. A lot of people refer to
Oh.
it as Kevin Bacon. I don't remember.
Really?
It was, when it was-
Interesting.
yeah, it was conceptualized in the '90s with like because of a trailer.
Yeah.
Where it was like Kevin Bacon knew this guy and this guy.
Mhm.
You know.
That kind of reminds me, I mean, getting into more serious shit, this reminds me of policies that NSA has about, like, who they're able to spy on. Because one of the things is, like, you can do 2 removes. So it's like, if you have someone you're interested in, 2 relations outside of that, you can spy on them too.
Mm.
But then they passed a rule that made it, that includes interaction with companies. So as soon as, you know, person number 2 goes to Google, now you can spy on people who go to Google.
Damn.
Yeah, so that really opened that up. So that's nice.
Yeah.
Yeah, can't
But anyway.
imagine there's much separation there.
Yeah.
We're gonna go with people who breathe. Let's,
Person A breathes, and breathers are suspicious.
Oh man. Alright, well, since we have Chris as a guest, it would be sweet to talk about some AI
Did you guys
stuff.
want to do introductions?
Yeah, let's get intro.
Yeah.
Go ahead.
I guess you
Guess
could
number 1,
tell us
Chris.
a little bit about your background if you want. We haven't talked about our backgrounds yet, but
We should probably do that too.
yeah.
Well, I'm from Alabama originally. Grew up, lived there for 20 some odd years. Let's see. Before I went to college, I was big into fencing in high school.
Nice.
I was ranked 250th in the world, 50th in the country in my division, and
Shit,
champion of the southeastern United States. Let's see. In college, I studied finance primarily. That was my major was finance. I had a minor in psychology. All my electives were in economics. After school, I worked in the finance side of things. I worked as a financial advisor, controller, financial analyst. But I've done a lot of like random little jobs, usually somewhere in between business and tech. I have worked for like the public sector some too. Like I've done some contracting for local governments and stuff. So I've kind of hit like just about any kind of angle you can see about a
Yeah.
company, small to large or whatever. But usually, like I said, I'm sort of focused on through my career, I focus more on like the business to technology. Like even as a financial analyst, I was working more to develop macros and stuff related to like making Excel better for the finance
Gotcha.
people than I was.
Got you.
Lately, though, I've also done about 5 years of independent study since I graduated college. It's been broken up. That's where I've gotten most of my technical expertise. Places like Coursera, where you can take tons of free online classes from the best colleges. I have a data science certificate from Johns Hopkins, where they have a really cool 10-course program on data science that you can do through Coursera,
Hell yeah.
and a bunch of other certificates through that. And yeah, lately in the past couple years, 2.5, I've been really focused on AI safety. since Elon Musk started trying to raise the warning, and then a lot of other people
Yeah.
like Stephen Hawking and Sam Harris.
A lot of alarm bells.
Yeah,
Yeah.
John Tillian, like, of course, Ray Kurzweil's been talking about this for a long time, has some of the most, documented, like, the Singularity documentary and
Right.
stuff, where his views are typically more optimistic. There's a wide range there, but I've been trying to get a broader picture of AI safety because it's not even just the idea of, like, okay, the safety of this particular AI program, but, like, the economic impact of AI safety. Like, what are we going to do when cars are automated?
Yeah, how's it
In
going
the
to
short
impact
run.
society as a whole?
Right. And then in the long run, even if we get AI right from, like, the design safety standpoint, how do we also, like, deal with the political and economic ramifications of having,
Well,
like,
yeah.
no need to work and stuff?
I mean, this is going to be like the second industrial revolution, essentially, in terms of how
Exactly.
radical it is
Yeah,
in changing relations.
And even probably more monumental than the industrial
Probably.
revolution. So,
Yeah.
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 So that's a lot.
Yeah, it's slightly terrifying, but I get it.
So what worries you most about AI? Oh, well, actually, you know what? We should probably do introductions about
Yeah,
first.
you guys.
Sorry.
It's
All right.
okay.
All right, so excited to get into it. But anyway, so I'm Dan. I'm still going to school currently, but my major is in history and education, and I want to be a history professor. I'm about to get my BA and go on for my master's, so still chugging along. What about you, Drew?
I'm Drew, and I just got my degree in psychology. Trying to figure out whether I want to go on the clinical side of things or more on the research side of things. Yeah, I've done a lot of just like free research and like philosophy, and I've done a lot of undergrads classes in biochemistry and chemistry, like more of the harder sciences, but have really gotten into like more soft sciences as it's gone on, just because of the human application to it. Yeah.
I think you both should talk about where you're from too.
Okay, that's fair. That was pretty brief. It's like
Yeah.
you go to school and
Yeah, I
like,
mean, his
introduce
intro was like
yourselves.
5
Yeah.
minutes.
Okay, let's see. So me and Drew and Sean is currently not here. We all grew up in the same town, which is like this little remote mining town, or old historic mining town in Northern California called Nevada City. And I grew up in like a little log cabin in the middle of nowhere. My dad was the local police sergeant at a department that had like 8 people, so it was a really small town. Let's see. We all moved up here to Oregon, which has been awesome. And I originally wanted to be a police officer like my dad, but that was kind of before I had done a lot of like serious introspection and like learning about the world and stuff. And I had kind of like, my existential questioning period where I decided I was doing that more just kind of following in his footsteps than what was actually what I wanted to do. And I took a year off of work, which was very fortunate that I was able to do that. I know a lot of people don't get the opportunity. But I just kind of, followed my interests wherever they took me. And I had always loved history, but I didn't really take it seriously because I thought it was just kind of a hobby. But I found with all my free time, it was just nothing but history. These guys know I'm always talking about that shit. I started with ancient Greece. I would always relate everything to something about Athens and Sparta, or the political dynamics in the city-states and all kinds of different things. And then from there it really spread. I got interested in Rome, and then especially once I became more involved in politics during 2016, I got way more interested in more contemporary stuff. So like the Great Depression and the New Deal and the Enlightenment, and kind of like the emergence of capitalism out of feudalism and that whole process. So my interests have really diverged in a lot of ways, but it all feels interconnected, starting from a grounding in ancient history, and I don't know, I love it. I eat it up. It's my favorite thing. So now I'm going to be a professor eventually. I definitely want to teach history, and yeah, that's what I'm working on.
Awesome.
Cool.
Yeah, like Dan said, we're from like Grass Valley, Nevada City area, and I think like one of the biggest difference between like Sean and Dan and I maybe would be like our upbringing. So like Sean, he's not, yeah, like Dan said, he's not here, but he grew up with like a bunch of siblings, like 7, and his dad was like a pretty wealthy guy. They lived up in like
A mansion, essentially.
yeah,
It used to
It
be
was
like an old
bed and breakfast.
bed and breakfast, yeah.
but both Dan and Sean were like living up in kind of like the mountainous area of like the town, whereas I was like pretty central in the town. And all of my like my dad, my stepdad, and my mom are all in the court system. So my dad was like has been a lawyer forever. My mom was she just retired, but was in being a secretary for a judge and various other like people within the court system for 30 years. And then my stepdad's now a commissioner. So I definitely had that like law influence, I guess, that more like a little bit more structured influence in that way. Whereas I think it feels like Dan's dad was a police officer, but he was like a pretty awesome police officer who didn't follow everything by the book, I guess, is like the best way to put it.
Well, in a good way. I mean, that cuts both ways.
Oh,
he was the good one.
Yeah. And Sean's dad, he ran his own business, so like since he was a kid, like put everything into it and lived in his like his first building for his business, so just until he could get enough money to like buy a house outside of it. So yeah, I think that like most of my interests for a very long time were centered in more like in the harder sciences. But as I got into college, I saw that like there was, I guess one of the biggest things that got me into like all of philosophy was I had an idea of like really wanting to help create a house that was like self-sustaining. And as I was like in researching that kind of stuff, I found that it's not because the technology's not there, but it's because the demand for it isn't there, which kind of got me into the reason why, like, okay, well, why is that a thing? And then you get into like all of the different, because to me it was so obvious that we needed it. If you think like ecologically,
I mean, just objectively, we do need it.
Right. And like it would be like, to me, I was like, this should be something that we're all like looking for, since it is something that we all have, like we all live in a home, and if we can make that like give us as much of like the energy and resources that we need to live, why not do that? And so, but going from that, I like kind of got plunged into just different ways people like look at the world, why everyone isn't ecologically minded, because there's like plenty of different like religions or worldviews that people like will ground themselves in. And so that I just got really interested in that for a while, and that got me really into like people like Carl Jung and Joseph Campbell and stuff like that. So listened a lot to their stuff, which really got me into psychology, and that's ultimately like where I decided to get my degree, just because I find it so fascinating that there's like a lot of research and development that has gone on, but for some reason there seems to be a disconnect between being able to actually like implement everything that we've developed in a way that seems to be like everyone agrees is a good idea.
Yeah, absolutely.
So that's I guess why I got planted into the psychology aspect of things. But I'm very much interested in like ecological thinking and like the cool developments in science and stuff like that, and how to apply that and help people, like to live better lives too in the philosophical realm.
Nice. All right, I guess it's my turn. So I grew up in Medford, and my dad was a chemistry teacher at the time, but in his past he got a degree in biology, worked for the Forest Service for a little while, managed a gun club, shot competitively, apprenticed himself out as a machinist, and was a gunsmith for a few years. So definitely a jack of all trades in a lot of practical ways, at least. And my mother was a social worker working for the VA, so I got a good healthy dose of like psychology and social work from her when I started talking to her more in high school. We didn't necessarily talk about those things before that, but I talked to her a lot about that during my high school years. And then I got a pretty good informal science education from my dad, just from talking to him about a lot of things. I also have been shooting since I was like 7, so that's a huge part of my life. And also just like building things, and so like hands-on stuff. So when I went to college, I did mechanical engineering and pre-med, the idea of going to medical school at some time probably, but mechanical engineering is more like a fallback career. And after graduating now, I'm kind of thinking that I want to get into robotics, so I'm thinking about going to get a master's in robotics now. And my interests as of late have been a lot into programming. I've been learning a lot about Python in the recent past, and I've been enjoying that a lot. I like the critical thinking that affords me. And I also have been studying a lot of history through, mostly through Dan Carlin and a few other podcasts.
Oh, yeah.
And my most studied era right now has been World War I and World War II, but also a little bit into the Genghis Khan and the Mongols, and then some into like the Roman Empire and a few other little specific parts of history, but I haven't studied nearly as much as Dan to be more exhaustive about. And not that anyone can actually be exhaustive about it anymore, but
no. The more you learn, the more you're just like, I don't know shit. It's so much.
Yeah, unfortunately, the more I learn about World War II, the more confused I get about different parts of it. It seems,
Yeah.
you know, I'm just like, wait, there was an African front? Fuck. And then like, oh shit, now I gotta learn about Japanese imperialism if I want to understand the Pacific front. And so, but anyway, so yeah, as far as like informal study, those are probably where I've spent most of my interests the past couple months at least, or maybe the past year, I would say. So yeah, that's kind of where I'm coming from, I guess. So I think that's probably a good enough introduction.
Yeah, I think that's solid.
Other things could be gleaned later on.
Yeah, I mean, that's barely tip of the iceberg there.
Yeah.
Whatever.
So now I think we can go ahead and go into AI safety. And
All right.
I heard that you had a question already.
Yeah, I mean, I guess a good place to start is just like, what worries you the most as someone who definitely spends a lot of time researching this stuff?
Yeah, so it's there's an interesting thing with the worry aspect, right? Because it's like there's the percentage of likelihood that this event's going to impact us,
Right.
and there's the actual devastation the event could cause, right?
Yeah.
There's a high percentage chance that self-driving cars, right, extremely high, is going to be an impact we're going to have to deal with. But compared to some of the other issues in AI safety, it has a lower devastation. So
We're
like,
just talking about job loss, essentially.
right? Yeah. I mean,
Yeah.
the disruption of the economy.
Yeah.
But when we look at like the actual like AGI, which is artificial general intelligence, meaning a human level or greater intelligence, right? The threat that could eliminate the entire human population, which is called an existential threat, right? If you guys ever look into that kind of stuff.
Definitely.
So, you know, stuff that's monitored by like the Future of Humanity Institute and the Future of Life Institute and stuff like that, the Center for Existential Risk and places. But yeah, AI safety, that's the first part we usually look at, because like obviously any existential risk, even if it's 0.0001%,
You should be
you know,
looking at.
yeah, it's
Yeah.
the end of everything, right? So it's
Yeah.
the worst possible
Take
thing.
that seriously.
Yeah. So, and the problem is too, we really can't put a percentage on what the chance is that we can
Because there's so
develop
many
safely.
unknowns.
Right.
Yeah.
It's really just a big question mark as to even the timeline to develop it, much less the timeline to develop it
Yeah.
safely. So that's I would say the biggest fundamental concern I have. But that doesn't necessarily mean that it'll have the biggest negative impact, obviously. Like, the disruption to the economy is just going to be so massive, and like we are 100% going to have to, like if we don't get destroyed, we 100% have to deal with this economic disruption. And, you know, a lot of the people in AI safety right now are typically more focused on the technical aspect,
Right.
and that's why we don't really have a lot of this conversation bubbling up yet. I mean, even with like self-driving cars, it's kind of starting to get there, but there's still like this pushback where people are like, nah, it's still far away. We don't have to worry about this.
It's gonna come pretty soon.
Oh yeah,
It's not that
I
far
mean,
off.
We're in a few years from having. I mean, there's cars already that are better drivers than humans.
Yeah.
You know, it's just the getting it deployed and getting the legal aspects of it taken care of first, right?
I think it's interesting the way, so like the way you're framing it now is nice, because even if we don't get an AGI, we're still going to have to deal with the impacts of AI
Exactly.
as that keeps
As they
becoming
unroll.
better and better.
Yeah.
And so like even if we don't have a flip the switch and the entire labor market is fucked moment, we're going to have little versions of that as we keep going regardless.
Exactly.
Which, if anything, I think that could actually be worse for political instability. I mean, the political situation is pretty sketchy right now as it is. I mean, there's a lot of, uptick in discontent. So
Yeah,
for
if you're
sure.
just adding boom, 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 shit's gonna start moving.
Yeah, and I really like the way that Sam Harris was putting it in his TED Talk about AI safety. where he was talking about like if we assume any amount of technological improvement at all, then we will eventually get to an AGI. And so if that's essentially an eventuality, unless our race gets destroyed somehow, then it doesn't make any sense to put our heads in the sand and be like, well, we'll deal with it later, because it's going to happen. So
and we're getting closer. So I mean, that should be like at the forefront of discussion is what does an AGI world look like?
Exactly.
Because that's where we're going.
Right.
It's so weird that that's happening almost on a parallel timetable to kind of like the more dangerous impacts of climate change unfolding. Like that's going to be over the next century.
Right.
AI is going to be over the next century. And both these things are things where we're just kind of putting it in the future where we don't have to think about it.
Yeah.
And yeah.
Totally.
And then when you think about the pairing of those two different things impacting society, it's going to be an interesting era.
Like you were mentioning the economic and political instability, and like how potentially having the more stilted development can make it worse. Because I mean the big concern is the way that like wealth's distributed, because AI just makes it so easy for a single person to just generate massive amounts of wealth,
and they don't
never
even need
to employ
workers.
anyone. Yeah. So like that's the problem, is that like do people just start snatching up one industry at a time, and we get more and more billionaires and trillionaires, and really at that point the trillionaires or billionaires can just hire all the AI experts, right? And then get them to keep building them stuff. So it's
dangerous.
I think the difficulty also lies both in like the climate change and as well as the AI is like, I think a lot of people don't feel like they have nearly enough information or effect on either of those matters to even like talk about them. So like I get that, like same with like everyone to be discussing those kind of things, but it's like I think the way that our society is structured right now seems to be that people will focus more on like what they have to do in order to like take care of their families or take care of like the day-to-day kind of stuff.
Right.
And they're hoping that there will be some underlying structure that will like allow them to take care of the earth, or like be able to talk about like AI. I don't even know if that's even on the radar for most people.
Right,
you know what I mean? Like they don't even like they're just like, well, the richest people will just be able to do anything at that point, which they kind of already do effectively in my life,
Right.
Well, we don't really have any institutional method to really educate and discuss these things anymore. I mean, the corporate media is essentially just geared towards viewership and entertainment and sensationalism. And I mean, it's not talking about any serious issues, whether it's climate change or inequality or AI. I mean, it's just a circus, and people aren't being educated. And I mean, the economic situation, is pretty tenuous already. People are having to work as hard as they can just to get by. And
exactly.
They don't have time to deep dive into, heavy intellectual issues about the future.
Right. Or spend like a whole weekend going to some sort of rally or something like that.
And I mean, we have a political climate where, most politicians are, like the media, wholly owned subsidiaries of different moneyed interests. So it's not like, you have some politicians starting to discuss these things, but we don't have like a vibrant political culture of discourse.
Well, isn't there difficulty in just like the most natural intuition coming from AI just being that it's like, I have no idea anything about AI unless I have any computer science background whatsoever. And then how am I supposed to control that whatsoever? Okay, so if I don't have control over it, who does? Smart rich people. And then you're just like, okay, and then what does AI do? Fix any problem? That's probably how like most people think about it. Okay, well they're going to be able to make the world however they're going to like want to do it. So it seems like such like an intuition that leaves people in the like, there's literally nothing I can do about it,
Yeah, and I think that intuition holds true with the climate science too, where people, in large part don't understand climate science from like a ground up perspective, which is understandable because it's extremely complex. But then you have to essentially take it on faith from people that you trust, quote unquote, that's a real thing.
Right.
So somewhere along the lines, you have to have trust in scientists and the scientific method and the scientific community as a whole, or in AI experts, and then you have to like listen to what they think you should do.
Right.
Yeah. And that's a lot of faith on one hand, and it's a lot of just I don't know, it's not like hand waving because it is more just like the faith aspect that those people know what they're talking about. But then I feel like most people are like, well, I don't understand this, and it's very like otherworldly to me, so I'm gonna assume that the people at the powers that be have got it. And like that's, I feel like a lot.
Well,
of
and it's not even happening in a neutral environment. I mean, it'd be one thing if you
That's
had that information present, and it's like, okay, are people going to be able to learn about this stuff and do something about it? But I mean, you have political and economic interests spending huge amounts of money to actively discourage people to come to conclusions that will disrupt those profits. I mean, we know oil companies knew about climate change like 50, 60 years ago, and immediately began propaganda efforts to try and get people to not realize it or to do anything about it.
And that actually could be more insidious than people think too, by sowing seeds of doubt in the scientific community.
Yeah, they have. I mean, that's a whole political movement now.
Yeah, and the fact that it's happened. Like, I mean, for people that are scientifically inclined, when they look at articles or they look at any kind of research that has been done that denies climate science, like there's holes that you can poke in it endlessly. And all of the renowned scientists do that. But from a layman perspective, it could seem more like there's not a consensus.
Yeah.
And there's like very loud voices from like 3 people that are like, climate change isn't real, and then other people are like, no, you're retarded. And then from a layman perspective, you might see that as like, oh, nobody knows, like it's not an agreement. And so I think that type of propaganda, like, it's hard to understand, for me at least, how much of an effect that could have.
I think it's pretty pervasive.
I feel like it could be too.
Certainly in the United States. I mean, apparently climate denial is way worse here than most countries.
Which is crazy.
Because the right wing, I mean, religious right in particular, has
Yes.
just driven the narrative against that.
Yeah.
I mean, one of the things with AI safety too is that unfortunately the narrative of AI safety isn't even like at the public level yet, because most people don't even believe that AGI is possible, right? So in the computer science community, everybody that knows computer science knows AGI is possible. So then there's a debate there between AI safety. Like some of them essentially say like, we got this, don't worry, and then the other ones are like, nobody could possibly have this. What are you talking about? So, but when we get to the actual public level, we're still at the point. The conversation's really still at the point of, is this even possible? I mean, would Jesus even let us do that?
See, there's a big religious part of that too. The idea that we could create something as sophisticated as humans are kind of smacks in the face of this whole the divinity of man and all that. So. I had an experience like that talking to my grandfather-in-law, he's a really smart guy, but he's like an old Jewish guy, and when I talked about AI, he was like, no, we can't make anything as smart as humans.
Right.
Whether God made us, we can't be that way. And I was like, okay, man, if you say so.
Yeah, that's definitely interesting. If we look at a lot of religions, they have a history of ignoring facts until they literally can't anymore. And it seems like they've kept up that tradition, or at least a lot of them have. That's this is kind of a parallel to that. I don't know if religion played a part in it, but I've been thinking about it because we're talking about like denial of science. Chris and I watched a Philip DeFranco video yesterday about where he mentioned that North Carolina had, I think it was North Carolina that had those projections of the sea level rise and ignored it. So the scientists came out, I want to say, I don't remember the exact day, but they came out several years ago, and I'll look it up in a moment, and they said that the sea level was going to rise 39 inches in the foreseeable future, and that they needed to do things about that. Right. And the government, looked at it and said that it would cost billions of dollars to essentially, make new flooding zones and fix up roads and do whatever is needed to sort of, mitigate the problems that are going to come with that. And they basically decided that it was going to cost too much. And then they essentially said that it wasn't going to happen. They made legislation that basically said that they could not use the scientific projections, and that they were only allowed to use historical data to predict the future.
And never use any policy based on the idea that the sea level is going to rise.
I read about that too. And it's been really troubling because the military is doing all kinds of tests on this shit and saying hey, we're gonna have to move these bases, all this different shit, and Congress is like, nope, pretend it's not real.
Yeah,
It's crazy.
it
Yeah,
really
that's-
is. I mean, just the coasts in general, every coast.
Oh, it's gonna be ravaged.
Yeah.
Well-
and there's so much on the coast too, like the bulk.
Well, it's
of
the
our
bulk of
economies.
human civilization is on the coast.
So, just
Yeah, go
before
for
you
it.
go in,
No.
from the Washington Post, that report came out in 2010, and it estimated a 39-inch sea level rise by 2100. And from the Philip DeFranco video, he said that it's actually risen an inch per year
Yeah.
in the recent past, like since that happened,
Well,
which
that's
is actually way faster.
That's
than
the
they
scariest
anticipated.
thing is if you keep up on climate science, every new thing that comes out is saying this is happening faster
Right.
than our worst case scenarios
Yeah.
were.
Yeah.
This isn't, and everyone's like, oh no, you're overblowing it. You know, the science is, you know, they're going overboard. It's like, actually, we were way below what it's actually gonna be. Like yeah. So
We wish that was right.
Yeah.
You understand?
And it's funny too because some people will I feel like some people use that narrative to sort of discount the narrative as a whole. They're like,
Yeah.
oh well, they said they were wrong, so like, do they really know anything anyway?
It's like-
and it's like, okay,
They're wrong in
their
the-
predictions
the
were
other
very
direction.
conservative. That doesn't mean they're wrong. Like,
They were like, we need to do something, I think, about this time. And then, yeah, it's not that we need to do anything less. We need to do it quicker. Like,
yeah, right.
still change. That's, I guess the bummer part for me, too, is that economically, like, that seems so awesome. Like, it's gonna cost billions of dollars, sure, but it's like, okay, it's all infrastructure based. You're gonna actually, like, improve cities, because now you can actually start funneling in, like, money to, like, re-establish, like, different, like, zoning and stuff like that. Like, put minds to developing our cities and developing, like, the land
it's
that
a
we
huge
work on and stuff like
opportunity.
that.
Yeah.
But,
But there is a significant loss. Are you familiar with the broken window fallacy in economics? So basically, the idea is that it's sort of how like people get the whole like war is good for the economy thing, right?
uh-huh.
So the idea is
It's
if,
good for
like,
the war industry.
Right. So the idea is like you have a baker's shop, right?
Yeah.
Some kid throws a rock and breaks his window.
Yeah.
Right. Well, the good thing about that is now that the window repair company gets to come have a job, right?
Yeah.
The baker pays him, $100 to
Totally.
fix the window. The problem with that is that if the kid hadn't broken the window, the guy might have went and bought a suit for $100
Yeah.
and tailor a job that's
Right.
actually
True.
creating something without
But
destroying.
that's also, I think, important to, like, look at what it is that we are currently spending our money on. So, like, and being able to
I agree, we
actually
should increase
evaluate.
infrastructure a lot.
Exactly.
Well, it's
And-
also, are we spending money that we actually have, or is this going to be deficit spending in order to spur, investment in production? Because,
Right.
I mean, the New Deal, we essentially just whipped money out of thin air and said, okay, we're going to invest all this shit in the country and just kind of, like, have faith that it's going to spur enough development that it'll pay itself out in the long run.
Yeah.
And so, I mean, there's that whole concept, too. Because, I mean, with just like a baker, it's like, he has money, and money that he's spending on this, he could have spent on something else.
Mhm.
But I mean, if it's like this big government initiative, we can just essentially.
And it's not. It's
invent
like there's
money.
gonna be
But
a
that
fucking.
does cause inflation, though. When you're
Yes.
inventing money, there is
Yeah.
ramifications to it.
And before you get into that, I wanted to say also that for instance, the Hurricane Florence that's going to hit North Carolina, it was downgraded to a Cat 2 now, but they're still expecting flooding in North Carolina of like upwards of 8 to 9 feet, I believe.
Jesus.
And so the estimated cost before they got downgraded was something like, I want to say $170 billion for rebuilding all the homes that were going to get destroyed. So, like, yes, obviously that's hindsight's 2020,
Yeah.
but it's one of those things where we have all these predictions that there's going to be a huge amount of destruction, and we can do some, preemptive spending that, will probably hurt in the short term, but, like, if we don't, what are the consequences?
Yeah.
You know, and in this case, it is almost like the broken window fallacy, where it's like, okay, a bunch of homes are going to get destroyed, and then the home industry is going to go berserk for a little while. But
Yeah.
is it worth the destruction? And then one other thing, I don't want to ramble too much about this, but one other thing that I think is interesting is thinking about this from an economic perspective is interesting and it's important. But I also like to think of it from sort of like a world resource perspective, and it's
Right.
like all that destruction is something that we can't really get back ostensibly,
Yeah.
right? I mean, there's going to be a lot of resources
Finite
that
resources
essentially
lost,
just won't
right. Yeah.
get recouped, and there's going to be an immense amount of energy that goes into building homes that will just be we
Well,
could have done for other things.
That's another huge thing we got to talk about. Is, I mean, our whole global civilization is built on the premise of infinite growth.
Yeah.
So that's, I mean,
Well,
that's
that's-
an even deeper root to the problem.
I mean, the fact that somehow our economic system is divorced from the idea that we are in a biosphere with limited resources, it's like, that's like, I can't even, I don't
Well, an
even,
economy based
I don't
on the
even know
idea of
where-
sustainability would
Yeah.
be radically different than anything
Totally.
we're familiar with.
well, it's just even, I mean, I guess again, we're getting into like the more like science aspect of it, but it's like, yeah, for anyone to deny that we do have limited resources, I think like scientifically it's just like, I don't know if that can even, if anyone could even say that that's like, like really okay to think.
I like the way Elon Musk framed it a little bit because he was talking about relative to like the electrical industry and stuff, and how people that are using fossil fuels are essentially being subsidized. Because people are always
Yeah.
angry that electrical cars and stuff get subsidized, but when you're pulling limited resources out of the ground and using up the CO2,
it's
capacity,
subsidized in terms of the cost to the future.
Exactly.
Were you watching that Joe Rogan interview he did? That was so
It
good.
was really good.
Yeah.
The one thing that I did want to say about like how I don't think that this is like the broken window fallacy is it's not that there is a kid who's gonna run and break open the door. It's literally like there is a hailstorm that comes every few years and we're saying it's gonna happen again and then we're just not going to do anything about it. We're going to pretend like the
that's
hailstorm
ridiculous.
isn't
that's
coming.
what happened here. That's
you know?
why, we want to do the infrastructure first so that it prevents the damage. We don't want to have to rebuild. We want to like stop it from occurring.
So it's not like, and it like I just think it's interesting that like the kid isn't gonna do it or not do it. It's like we're pretty sure it's gonna happen. It's just when it's gonna happen.
I think you guys agree on this for sure.
Oh yeah. Yeah, and I mean, I think there's a strong silver lining. There could be a lot of jobs made if we did like a big jobs program to change over the infrastructure, and really just kind of modernize the country. I mean, it's a huge opportunity, even though there's going to be massive costs. And I mean, quite frankly, if we're thinking in terms of like the risk of inflation, I mean, better to do it now while we still have the dollar as the reserve currency of the world, which is the biggest defense against that of any country. I mean, there's a lot of countries working to make us lose that, so we're going to be in a way worse position in the future, so we might as well do it now.
Yeah. I just think that one of the coolest things that we probably could do as like a nation is accept that there is like this kind of like the ecosystem-based biosphere thing that's occurring, like at least a system that's happening that we have to work within. Because that, I think, in and of itself, like, if we can agree on that, and I don't even know if that's, like, a religious thing at all,
I think
like
there's a spiritual
worldview
aspect
thing.
to it.
I think it can come from that. I think it's very much scientifically, like,
We should
based.
certainly seek spirituality as an ally in that fight.
For
I
sure.
mean, because the oldest spiritualities universally across human history all had some kind of environmental sacredness that they grounded themselves in, and their idea as part of the ecosystem and the necessity of sustainability and stuff like that.
Totally.
And the only reason why I would like why it comes to me in that kind of way, like why I even brought up the religion thing, is because it seems to be future predicting, and it seems to be that right now people, for some, like the scientific community, they're like, yeah, it's gonna happen, right? But then there's so many people who are not in the scientific community.
We need to
say,
move it on the cultural
I don't
level.
know.
Yeah.
And that's why I like to, it is cultural, I think, that we need to be able to, like, as a country, say that it's occurring. Because we're the
there's some
only one who
movements-
didn't sign.
I
We're
know.
The only
we
country.
pulled out of it. We pulled out.
Yeah.
Yeah, I mean, it's just like...
It's because we have a very special president.
Yeah.
Well, I mean, his core base is the evangelical fundamentalist Christian movement.
Which
Well,
is
the
crazy
fact-
because he's not even really a Christian.
Well, no, but I mean, you see how they justify it. They'll say shit like,
it's ridiculous.
God works through an imperfect instrument and all this shit, and it's...
Have you seen the Pew results where like 30% of fundamentalist Christians believe he's the Antichrist but voted for him anyway?
No, I didn't see
Because
that.
they want him to bring about the end of the world.
Yeah. Well, I mean, my favorite journalist, Chris Hedges, did some deep undercover work with the Christian fundamentalist community, and his conclusions were that so many of these people, they come from a place of, these broken cities, in the heartland, and just places of absolute despair and hopelessness, and they get sucked into these like cult-like, societies, and they really do hate the world that did this to them. That's one of like the core views in this journalist's perspective. And that the reason there's kind of like this fetishization of the apocalypse is because they want revenge on a world that abandoned them.
Depends on the sect. So I was
For sure.
I was raised as a Christian fundamentalist, unfortunately.
So was my girlfriend, actually. Yeah,
nice, yeah.
yeah, it's rough shit.
Yeah, it really is.
Congratulations on merging.
Thank you. I still have a lot of baggage from it. Cause
You always will.
Yeah, it's crazy. Some of the stuff that they like try to brainwash you with as a child.
See, that's a whole different thing. It's like someone who's converted to it versus someone who's raised within it.
Yeah, being told when you're like 6 years old, oh, Satan's gonna come get you at night if you don't be good. Like that's just some like fucked up shit for a little kid to be like thinking.
Seriously,
it makes it hard to sleep.
No, seriously. I mean, my girlfriend, she's always telling me how it's like. I mean, she's come out of it too, and she largely doesn't believe any of this stuff, but it's still left all these imprints on her. Like even though she ostensibly and intellectually doesn't believe it anymore, there's still that fear of like hell and damnation and all of these vivid archetypical
sins,
concepts.
Like things that we've had drilled in our head as sin that we can logically realize aren't sin. Like
but there's still that internalization of the guilt and the shame and the judgment and.
Well, and I think that's one of the coming from a psychological standpoint, it's like there's like the content and the pattern, like you and I were talking about the other day. It's just like there's the content would be like what is sin, like what are the things that are sin, and then the like pattern would be like the feelings and everything you get when you sin. So it's like I guess this would be kind of like a Jordan Peterson approach to it, but it's like there's like that self-criticism that's like infused in the sin, where your premise is that there's like this almighty being that knows what's right, and then you did something that was against that thing that was right, and now you're gonna feel bad about it, or you're gonna, I mean, it goes to the point where it's not even feel bad, it's be so terrified you can't sleep kind of idea.
Yeah.
So like that would obviously no psychologist ever would recommend that, you know, no one would say that that's a good thing, I don't think, and so like, but being able to try to remove the like negative aspects of the sin, but then also keep this idea that there might be some things, like I feel like moral grounding itself is rooted in the fact that there might be some things that should make you feel bad, not in the way where you're hurting yourself or being hurt.
See, I think even though I don't come from a religious background, I do a lot of that shit. Like I have a very one of my biggest things internally, psychologically, is that I'm constantly hardcore judging and criticizing myself for any time I'm like violating my own principles. So at least my principles can change, as opposed to like when you're in a religious setting where they're given to you. But it's still, I mean, it's still very self-abusing to kind of be that hardcore about it.
Well, and I wonder, I mean, again, psychologically, that's a huge one for like behavior control. It's like that is kind of like negative. That would be like negative punishment, I guess. At that point, you are getting something, and it could be positive. It depends on how you're using, like what goal you're looking for. But it's like you've done something and you have a negative reaction to it, so don't do that thing anymore, right? And I
tend to just do it and just keep shitting on myself.
Yeah,
sounds healthy.
Yeah, sounds really healthy.
When I become a psychologist, come see me.
I think you were a little too biased for me.
No.
Just a little bit. No, but that's
best friend of more than a decade.
But I think the psychology community also definitely believes more in positive reinforcement.
Yeah,
so
sure.
really,
Which is funny because it's like, I know that in terms of like, you know, how you treat your dog, but it's like, but me, I'm gonna be a freaking tyrant.
But it's definitely interesting trying to find that balance within, you know, personal motivation.
Yeah.
It's like I have a problem with that as well, where like if I'm not hard enough on myself in a negative manner, then I tend to sort of relax and stop doing things that were really positive for me.
Right.
You know? But it's also it obviously waxes into a very negative cycle where if you're just, you know, harping on yourself for not doing good enough or for not doing enough for the things that you want, you know, whatever thing, that can obviously turn into this negative cycle of just hating yourself. Which I think it's like, at least especially for me, it's very important to maintain like a healthy dose of, you're doing fine, but you need to be doing a little better. Like, keep
Yeah.
moving forward. Like,
Yeah.
there's these things you need to work on. And so, like, trying to find that balance of, like, you fucking suck.
Yeah.
And, like, you're great is hard for me, because when I have those moments of you're great, it's like awesome. I'm gonna lay down, watch some TV.
Yeah.
And then those moments
Yeah.
where I'm like, you fucking sucked. I'm like, God damn it.
See, I
guess
do that
should go to the
too.
gym.
I do that too, where it's almost like a bipolar thing.
Right.
Yeah.
But I mean, I love this idea intellectually. Not that I've done enough work at actually applying it, but the whole idea of like treating that inner voice as like your inner parent, you know, and thinking like, how if this voice was me parenting my child, what would I think about that? And be like, oh my god, I'm being a horrible parent. It's like, so, and trying to change that voice in a way where if it was your kid, you'd be like, solid, I'm doing good.
Well, and that's
That's a good way to think about it.
Yeah.
I like that. Like, pulling away, like, one step removed from yourself.
Yeah, because I think that's the biggest problem is we don't treat ourselves objectively.
Right.
You know, we have a hard time applying the same standards to ourselves that we do other people.
Mhm.
Whether, you know, we're being too easy on ourselves or too hard on ourselves.
Certainly.
well, and that's why I think that's like a lot of the time I advocate for like certain like community or environment like changes more than like internal changes, because I do think that like a mindfulness and a way of viewing things is really important. To be able to have that self-control, really, it comes down to that point of like being able to like in cognitive behavioral therapy, like a huge part is reframing. So being able to take a situation where that like, yeah, those events happened, but you're also you are also seeing them in a certain light.
Exactly.
So one of the big things that they try to do is to create a different frame to look through, so that you can actually have like positive ways of like at least being able to let it go, not fixate on it. So, but like to me, it also I advocate for that, the inner parent thing, like being able to take that reframing on that cognitive aspect. But the one thing that I always worry about is that that can become a very good tool to not do actually anything externally. So like you have to be, or I guess not advocate for there being an overall environment change. So like behavior change and environment change are two different things. So you're using that in a way where you're like, I need to go work out. Like that's another behavior that you need to go. So you need to go to another environment where there's like whatever you need to work out. You can do it in your room if you wanted to.
Sure.
But so for me, one of the things is also like the importance of changing the environment to allow certain behaviors to occur, which I think that is such a huge point for like infrastructure doing society-based things. It's like, what behaviors do you want your environment to increase? You know?
So,
So-
how do you differentiate the two? Because, like, to me, the individuals make up the community. So, like, in order to have a community change, you start at the individual level. So, I'm kind of like, where do you see the
Oh, that's interesting.
environment?
Totally.
So-
I'm a
Well-
little bit more the other way, but
It's-
that'll be interesting to get into.
For
Go
me,
ahead.
it's I mean, it's a layered thing. So like the idea, I guess, is like if we take into consideration that like we see time as like a linear fashion, you have this idea that like there will be a certain time where people are developing, and I'm just using this example because it is like a lot of people's way of looking at the world already. But it's like you, as a child, you have very little control over your life. Like almost everyone can do something to you to make you do something, right? So that is like a point at which you don't have that's like no personal effect on that. That's all environment.
Limited agency.
Yeah, exactly. Limited agency for sure. So the idea though is that kind of limited agency can occur almost I would say infinitely. It's just that the outside controls change, so the environment changes. So we like to house that in like if you do like a scientific worldview, you can go look at like, well, what are the laws of physics? What are the laws of the biosphere? Because those are limiting me. I have no control over those things. But what I can do is, taking that as my rule set, I will work within those things to change my behavior, right?
Okay.
So, but one of the things that I think we forget about as like people sometimes, I guess this is more like an intuit, I haven't thought about it like enough to really say whether or not this is true, but it's like we forget that what we can also do is make a lot of community oriented like places that will influence people's behavior. So like, why do you go to school to learn? That whole idea of like the university of like, why is it that if you go to a few buildings that are all like centered on certain things where there's like a philosophy going on, like there's the people just come there to show up and like speak words at you, now you'll learn. But maybe in your off life, you know, or in your like free life, you don't do that there.
Right.
Why is that you're productive at work,
But
you're not productive at
It's a
home?
self-discipline issue. Because a lot of people,
Well-
because I've like learned from home for like my whole life, so like I can study at home really
Yeah.
easily. But like a lot of people can't take online classes. So
Totally.
like nobody knows that I didn't do my
Right.
work.
Which I will. So
And-
for. Oh yeah, please no.
He was
I was just gonna say that also you probably have set up your office in such a way that facilitates that to a certain
yeah, that's
degree.
important.
And so
know your
yeah,
habits and everything.
so it's
There's
still
a lot
an
that goes
environment.
into
yeah,
it.
Too.
and there's lots of things that can
Well,
influence
to
it,
an
you
extent.
know,
To an
which is
extent.
like it's like Jordan Peterson's advocating for cleaning your room. You know, that sort of gets you in the mindset that everything's in order and I'm going to do these things. And on a more societal level, you know, you can start to make places that somewhat influence people to be more like that.
Exactly.
And you're not necessarily trying to take the most conscientious, self-disciplined person and make them do the things that they're already doing more. You're more trying to get those people that are, more environmentally focused to sort of,
Exactly.
direct in a certain way.
Well, and I do think it varies. I mean, you have people who are very individually grounded, you know, they've seized mental control over their life, you know, and they refuse to let the environment really impact them, or at least as much as they can.
Right.
They're trying to seize control of their, you know, their behavior and all that.
There's definitely a scale of people,
Yeah.
like environment to individualism.
And
like
I
how much
think
impact
it has a lot to do with kind of, your circumstances. I mean, I think a lot of people, they're, just trying to make enough to get by, and they have all these external responsibilities, and a lot of times they don't feel like they have room to take control.
Yeah.
This idea of like necessitous men are not free men. The presence of necessity overtakes, your ability to exert your free will in a sense. And I agree with that in the sense that the more you're having to deal with things that have to be done, the less you can exert your free will over what you'd like to do. So just kind of the idea of like, our societies, the structures that we create around us are an environment. It's no different than being in the jungle, as a hunter-gatherer, or, like Drew was saying, the idea of the biosphere as a whole. It's, you create an environment, and to a certain extent, you're going to have to adapt to the needs of that environment. And so if we think about that and try to create an environment that facilitates certain ways of life over others, in ways to make it easier for certain things, I think that's really important.
Yeah. I just wanted to jump in with one little. I have a couple, like, these aren't necessarily perfect examples, but I think a good example is having more recycling bins available.
Right.
That's something that easily facilitates a behavior that most people in the society say is positive. And we've noticed it's pretty easy to see that, say you have a trash can every, 100 yards and you have recycling bins every 500 yards on a
There's going to be less recycling.
There's less recycling.
Yeah.
People just throw their recycling in the trash because
Yeah.
it's not immediately available.
Yeah.
And a sort of a slightly different, maybe like more psychological aspect, people have done some research and unfortunately I don't know who did the research, but there's been research done about like playing classical music in public areas, and it's shown that violent crime will go down in those areas
That's
from
amazing.
just having classical music being played.
See, and I feel like this brings up a wider conversation, which is like, in what areas is it more effective to try and influence individual behavior or change environmental factors? Because I think it's going to differ from situation to situation.
No, and I totally agree. One of the things that I thought that would be a really good illustration of that is I never think that you shouldn't be able to have a space where you go to and then be able to do whatever the fuck you want. You should have a home, basically, is that idea where it's you get a lot. You don't have to need anything if you've gotten everything that you need, obviously.
It's interesting, parallel to that, though. So, at the home level, too, the environment's a big issue. And, thinking about, impoverished communities, right? The environment, that they're stuck in an environment where they're
that
no
state of
reason.
necessity.
Yeah. And they don't even necessarily have an idea of how to get out of it.
Well, and I think one of the things that I want to, make clear is that it's not as though wealthier people don't have necessities, but that they are so able to fulfill those necessities that they just that they don't even think about them.
A lot of them are kind of necessities of choice. You know what I mean? It's not like you're gonna die if you don't
Yeah, I
make
mean,
a
really-
good business
Well,
move.
I'm
Like-
just saying you could die if you don't eat.
I mean, that's true.
True.
So
But
that-
I think like having the needs of a business owner is different than like being a poor
Like
father.
at the poverty line where
Yeah,
you're
and
actually
being
buying
like,
food.
Right.
being like, I need to feed my children tonight.
Yeah.
Like,
Well, yeah, I am trying to ground it in actual needs. So there are the psychological needs that are those are
Priority
more
needs.
difficult.
Yeah.
Right, exactly. Yeah. So Maslow is pretty good for that. That's
certainly a good way to think about it.
Yeah, I think so.
I know
But-
that it doesn't technically work that way, but yeah.
But the only reason why like I'm I guess stressing the fact that there are the needs is because I think if we actually are able to agree on that, like on the fact that so like saying everyone needs to eat, we still don't really even say that because there's starvation that's occurring and stuff like that. But the idea would be like everyone needs to eat. How do we make that the best thing? How do we make that like the most like sustainable, most economical, most like I guess like effective system for good behaviors. So it's like if we all say that health is also a need, right? To be healthy is also a need. It's like there are plenty of people who would say that that's not a need. Like you need to be in a healthy weight. It's like there's a lot of people who would say, well, we don't even know what a healthy weight is. And it's like it's obviously way bigger than what we portray as like magazine covers of like beautiful women or beautiful men. There's obviously a way bigger dynamic between that. But also if we say that you're like 600 pounds, like we're pretty sure that that's
pretty tough
not
to live a
good,
good life,
right?
yeah.
Exactly. But yet we still don't have any kind of like real regulations on food, right? And so there's like this weird dichotomy between like freedom and then good systemization towards like things that we actually do need. I feel like there's a lot of needs that we
this
like.
is tough because like I feel like you can go overboard really quickly because
Right.
it's
Yeah.
like
Well, they
you
need
know
to
on
be
one
defined
hand
well.
it's like you don't want to make it so people can't go eat shitty food
no,
because like that's gonna get really dark really quickly.
Right.
Right.
But like you want to make it so there are economically and conveniently available forms of healthy living.
Yeah.
That should be a thing.
I'm not saying that this is easy, and I'm
Yeah.
not saying that it doesn't need to be really nuanced.
See, but like we're getting into the whole environment versus individual thing again because it's like for a lot of people, buying a quick, easy, shitty meal is all they really have time or money or
But
knowledge
why
for.
so the shitty part isn't necessary. The quick and easy and cheap,
It's
that
a
is.
dopamine
But it's-
spike. They're not
yeah.
buying the food for nutrition. They're buying it for the
Right.
dope. It's like a drug.
Right.
Yeah,
you know?
absolutely.
But what I'm saying-
and people, the more desperate people's situations, the more prone they are to getting addicted to those
Exactly.
kinds of things.
I agree, but if we don't say that there is also an economic effect on that, I think that that's
What do you
not
mean?
reasonable.
What
Oh
economic
yeah, I mean the
effect?
cost to society from that is massive, just
Oh,
from like the
yeah.
health side.
Well,
the
and
medical
the-
costs and the even
and
just the
people
interpersonal.
who create those kind of foods. Like I get that there's like a sugar, there is like you can train your tongue to be able to be sensitive to the point where you don't need to eat a whole pint or more, a whole gallon of ice cream.
Sure, that's true. You can, but the issue is that it's way easier to prey upon pre-existing programming from thousands of years of
I agree.
having fat, salt, and sugar be
Right.
really hard to
Rarities.
I
decide.
Yeah.
agree, but again, I'm saying that's a prey thing.
Yeah,
People,
It is.
that's not, to me, that's not an ethical thing. They're not
No, it's
trying
not.
to
I
make
don't
the
think it's
system as
ethical
good
either.
as possible.
Right.
They
Well,
are
I mean,
trying
that's a
to.
really core part of our economic system.
Yeah. But
profit over morality.
But do you see how that whole idea divorces it from the environment and benefiting either the individual or
Oh,
the
completely.
system?
I mean, if we wanted to loop it back again to climate change, I mean, next to fossil fuels, the next biggest impact is animal agriculture.
Yeah.
And
Oh, yeah,
then a
for
huge
sure.
part of that is, the fast food industry. It's
Yeah.
a big chunk of that market.
Yeah.
So,
In my opinion, what's going on in that area, like looking back at history, where we look at back, like
Oh, it's
Holocaust
gonna
and shit,
be
that's gonna
disgusting
be
in the
most,
history
like,
books one day.
barbaric thing is like how the hell did
well, I mean,
people
it's
think this was
it's
okay?
it's practically like
Yeah.
industrial torture,
Yeah,
and
exactly.
then feeding people the meat of these creatures that have just been in these like mechanical torture machines.
Pump full of antibiotics. That way we fuck up our freaking antibiotic.
Dude, yeah,
resistance.
we're gonna have all these antibiotic resistant bugs because of it. I think something like 60% of our antibiotics are used on animal agriculture.
Yeah, you see,
and
like,
so you have them in
chlamydia just got discovered recently.
and so you have like these like cesspools.
Gonorrhea. It was
Sorry.
gonorrhea.
Oh, okay. Well, you have like these cesspools of like these just absolutely repulsive conditions, and then you're just flooding that with antibiotics,
Yeah.
and those bacteria is like, ooh, that's evolved. Like, it's
Yeah.
disgusting. It's absolutely disgusting.
Well, according to a new report, this is from Sustainable. Wait. Sustainable Table. Sorry, that was weird for me to read for some reason. Sustainabletable.org says, according to a new study by the FDA, approximately 80% of all antibiotics used in the United States are fed to farm animals.
Damn.
Yeah, so if you look at that, I mean, like,
Wow. So my brain thought 80 was too insane and
So it's
60.
I mean, this could just be a new thing too. It might change.
Maybe it went up
might be going
20%.
I mean, holy fuck.
I just think that, like, the idea that I'm trying to get across overall is that there's an individual and an environment.
Right.
You don't just
People
center
forget about
on
one or
one.
the other all
Right,
the time.
exactly.
Well,
Like,
I mean,
still try to
yeah.
improve both.
Right.
Well,
Right.
it's like with climate again. I mean, there's the environmental factor of the economic system, the market itself, you know, and so you have these oil companies going, well, you know, the profit motive and these other things, and so I'm going to sacrifice the future for profit. And so, I mean, that environmental factor is very real. If you create alternative incentives within the environment, it's going to shift behavior.
Exactly.
Right.
And there are many situations where that's going to be more effective than lecturing someone. Be like, well, you'll make a lot of money if you
100%.
fuck us over, but don't do it
Yeah.
because that's
Really.
bad.
Looping back around a little bit to the whole like subsidy problem with electric cars and stuff like that. You know, that's I think one of the best ways to go about that is to make it so cheap to use sustainable products that
Yeah,
the
exactly.
alternatives become
Right.
silly.
Yeah.
You know, because right now it's essentially the opposite. If you don't think about the ethical problems
Yeah.
or the impact that it's having, then the less sustainable products are way cheaper. And that's the problem is most people are just at the supermarket, for instance, looking at price change, and they're like, well, I could get this steak for $10 or this steak for 20. And
Yeah.
you know, most people are going to obviously go for the cheaper option.
Yeah.
So I think one of the only ways that you can start to shift at least our society towards a more sustainable, you know, system or more sustainable consumption is have heavy subsidies to drive the costs of better
Right.
alternatives down, and maybe even taxes to drive the cost of, you know,
Like
less.
carbon
Yeah,
tax or
that's
something.
what we need is to tax the people that
Carbon
are you know,
tax.
subsidized for free, basically.
Well,
like
yeah,
you
I
said.
mean, we need to
Yeah,
start
that's a good
taking
idea.
into account the future cost. 'Cause,
Yes.
I mean, that's very real.
Well,
So-
that's and again, that's I guess the worldview thing that I stressed earlier that I think is so important is to tie it to the whole idea of like the biosphere, because all of everything that we're talking about right now has to deal with like sustainability. Every time you say sustainability, you need to work. Okay, well, what are you trying to sustain?
Right. Yeah.
You know, and that's like, okay, well, if we have the biosphere to work with, at least we can say we have these resources. At the very least, these are the resources we know. But we can go I think we can go way more intricate than that, because we're also talking about like morals and stuff. Like if you look at like
Well, yeah,
how,
what kind of life do we want people to have?
Exactly.
That's really the core of the discussion.
because we're you can live in a very wide variety of things. Humans are very good
adaptable.
at
That's
adapting.
very different from a good life.
Exactly.
What we're capable of adapting to, and what is like good for a vibrant and
Long-term.
well-lived human life.
Long term too.
Yeah, long term for
Yeah.
sure.
Because even, you know, I think that's a huge part of the climate problem too, and the AI problem as well, is just the scope of it. Like 50 years isn't, you know, 50 years is one of the short-term projections, or the like the shortest term projection for when we could have AGI on like an average. I can't remember
It was
exactly.
roughly, if you
Yeah,
poll all
yeah,
computer scientists, the average computer scientist will tell you around 2050 is when they expect
2050?
AGI.
Okay.
That's
Thank you.
right around
for-
when we're
for
going to start
clarifying.
seeing some of the shitty parts of climate change.
So
See, that's interesting too. Is what are going to be the applications of AI?
I feel like the first
hopefully
thing it's going to do
dealing
is
with
fix climate
yeah,
change.
yeah.
You know?
yeah. So anyway, what I was trying to say with that though is that it's even if it's 32 years, which is shorter than 50, like I was saying, I feel
Yeah.
like a lot of people have trouble abstracting like how to deal with that. You know, it's
Yeah.
so far away, and a lot of people too, I think, especially older generations, have this mentality of well, climate change may be happening, but I'll probably be dead when it hits, and
Okay,
so
well, I'm not going to be Graham, so like.
so it's hard for people to make decisions here and now that make their lives harder, like spending more money on more sustainable food or whatever it may be, that will better the lives of people that they don't even know, or the future that they may not care about, for instance.
See, I really do think that kind of like individual choices within the marketplace is completely insufficient, given the trajectory we're currently on. I think we need big, radical changes.
I think it's just logically incorrect, too. It's like, the moment that the system gets more power than the individual, it will always snowball then at that point.
Yeah.
The individual doesn't have choices anymore.
All hierarchies tend towards authoritarian dominance eventually.
Yep.
It's interesting, though, because, sure, like a small scale, voting with your dollar doesn't really have a large scale impact, but if we can start movements where those types of things are happening on a much larger scale, I do think that could have an impact.
It could have an impact. I think my own personal preference is that the best way I've seen it described is that we need a movement that understands that we need to change things in a more fundamental, systemic way, but that you should still have as part of that movement kind of that individual activism, less because you think it's going to be what fixes everything, and more just kind of like as a way in grounding your resistance and your own moral authority as an individual to say, it's a symbolic way to ground that resistance. And I really like that. That's a good idea. But if you get too stuck in the idea that it's your fault because you're not recycling and you're eating meat and you're driving your car, I think it's going to cause more harm than good. And even a serious effort by people to change that, I think, will not be strong enough to defeat the systemic forces that are going to push against them for their own interests.
Yeah, I definitely think there's a very good case to be made for that. And like the whole be the change you want to see in the world, I think that's important for, like you're saying, moral consistency.
Right.
And for you to really evoke that, kind of rhetoric that helps to change people's minds.
Sort of a stoic mindset.
Exactly. But it can't just be that. Because it won't be enough. I agree with you.
And I think there's been a lot of effort to kind of push people into that way of thinking, because I think it just kind of turns their criticism inward instead of them going out to try to change something in the world.
Right. You got to get that first, and then once you got your baseline, you got to go out and actually help other people.
Exactly.
And it's also a very common fallacy that gets used. I think it's one of the more common ones that people don't call people on, is kind of like the U2 fallacy, where it's like you come to someone for like a small scale example, you come to someone with a problem and you're like, hey, I don't like it when you say, negative things towards me. Right. And they're like, well, you say negative things towards me all the time. And it's okay, so that's like a separate argument, right? It's like, okay, well, if you also have a problem, then we can talk about that afterwards. But right now we're talking about what you do to me, and that's this separate entity, right? And so it's kind of, you can extrapolate that up where, somebody comes up and they're like, hey, I don't like that you're destroying the planet with, such and such industry. And they're like, well, you buy meat all the time, and that's bad. Or you drive your car, and that's bad.
One does not cancel out the other.
Exactly.
Yeah.
So I have a question for you guys. Thinking back to the nutritional side, what would you guys think about a sin tax on sugar? Like something like what we have on marijuana and alcohol and stuff like that, to try to discourage.
I think that is completely reasonable.
Yeah, I mean, we do that with cigarettes, and that's been very effective.
Yeah, and we know how harmful sugar is now.
It's bad.
Well, it's both harmful and addictive. It's literally I can't see any.
Yeah, it's nature's candy, man.
It's almost an even more insidious harm, at least now, because
it's in everything,
and because we don't
such
talk about it as much.
absurd level. Yeah, it's normalized. It's completely normalized.
Because the sugar industry did so much to suppress research for so long and
change the food pyramid. Like, what the fuck?
See, that's another thing. Is kind of like that. That corporate, manipulation of scientific consensus is.
Like we were talking about earlier. And that one is probably one of the most effective examples, where it's works better than almost anything.
Because it's so unconscious.
Yeah. Yeah, that one's that's despicable. So yeah, I mean,
I'm
I'm
with
definitely
you.
be for attacks
you.
on that,
And you take all
especially
that money and use it for health, public health.
Public
Yeah.
awareness and
and even like a public healthcare system. If we want to try to fund one of those
We need
in the
that no
future.
matter what.
I think it's been done in some really dumb ways. Like I know there was like the governor of New York a while back. I think Bloomberg. Anyway, he made big sodas illegal.
Oh yeah.
That's
It's like
a little
that's
too
the
far.
stupidest
Too far.
way to deal with this problem I can think of.
It's just like marijuana, right? You bring it in, you give it a huge sin tax. People will pay a 40% tax and shit because they don't want to be criminals.
Yeah.
It's, nobody's gonna have a black market of sugar if you put a 20%
and then
tax.
use that money to help fix the problem.
Yeah.
Well, the moment that you
Especially-
actually...
Sorry, I was just gonna say, especially high fructose corn syrup. But
Yeah.
The moment that you actually put the syntax on there, even if that, I don't even know how difficult that would be, probably fucking terribly difficult.
Yeah.
But
Oh, the lobby, yeah.
but
Yeah.
Sugar would fight that hard.
the moment that you do
Same with
that,
oil, carbon tax. That's a
Yeah.
big fucking fight.
but the moment that you do it, it's like that people will ask why, because it is one of those things that you're like, everyone or no one thinks about.
Right.
So it's like the moment you do it, they're like, what the fuck? This is like, why would that ever be a thing? And then you have to be like, well, here's what it does to you, and then you're like, oh.
Yeah, I mean, it would be nice if that could spark a little more conversation about that,
Yeah.
for sure.
Yeah, I feel like it's a tougher one too because it's so I don't know, integrated into so much of the food we eat. Whereas with something like cigarettes, this is going to be like, okay, here's this thing you buy, and it's this isolated thing, and we just want you to stop smoking it. Like that's very different than
and it's
we need to
luxury.
change how everyone makes food.
The idea would be that like cigarettes are luxury, but it's like if we just decided to take tobacco and spread it through like everything that's on the shelves in the fucking
Yeah, right.
Well, like,
It's like
fucking
nicotine
cocaine.
in your cereal.
Exactly.
Well, they used to put
Exactly.
actual cocaine in Coke.
Yeah.
Yeah. Dude, yeah.
And now they basically do, again, with just like high fructose corn syrup at such high levels that, it's
Ton of
basically,
caffeine,
it's still addictive. Although, of course, not as much, but still. Yeah.
Oh no, nowhere near so much.
Yeah. But, like I was saying, it's almost more insidious because of that.
Yeah.
So, how do you think we should respond to AI?
So that's a complex one. I
Yes,
think
it
right
is.
now,
That was pretty broad.
Right now, where we're at is sort of in a recruitment phase. There's just not enough people talking about it or thinking about it. In particular, like I
So
mentioned
it's just
earlier.
raising awareness right now.
Yeah, because like I was saying, like it's so focused on like just the machine learning experts, like the people that really know this stuff are the ones that are more thinking and talking about it. And then you sort of in the past few years had like more like philosopher types, like you know Bostrom and Sam Harris and all these people getting more into it. But it's still mostly like the cognitive sciences really understand the brain and stuff. But like we don't have a lot of viewpoints. Like we need a historical viewpoint. We need a guy that's a PhD in history that's also an expert in AI, safety that can talk about like maybe where problems in the we've had with technology in the past, how we can learn lessons from that to maybe stuff like that.
Definitely.
Or approaching it from like a more psychological standpoint or more like ethical philosophy standpoint. Because the big central issue we talk about a lot is the value alignment problem with AGI. It's just a quick way of saying that like we need the AGI system to be aligned with human values, which we don't even know the human values. So like some of the theories are that like we need maybe the system to determine our values, which is also
human values
another...
in theory or in terms of how they've manifested in our current
That's
society.
the problem. Yeah, because you don't want the manifestation. Right?
No, because if you say
you want them to find the best values for you, which is like how do you even do that?
Yes,
so that's the problem.
Because the values as they've manifested in our current society are largely about accumulation of power and profit at any cost.
Right.
I mean I don't want AI thinking like that.
Yeah.
We're bad.
The other thing that I always think
that
about
example
when we're talking about like AI alignment problems is, once you start giving, or even not giving, once you make a real AI that's going to be able to reprogram itself, how do you even control its motives anymore? Because it could probably reprogram those too. Like I know I've talked to you about this before, but just like that to me is the interesting part of that discussion is like, okay, even if we can ground the principles of what we would ideally like the AI to do for humanity, and we can have some sort of consensus for that seems like it could work. How do we even corral it enough to make sure
so
that
the technical
is
side,
that it has to, in order, if it's going to change its own values, there has to be like some motivation for it to change its values. So just like with humans, it's kind of the same thing. So the idea is hopefully it's like kind of a controlled explosion. We just get it going in the right direction where hopefully it doesn't like the next minute decide, oh, humans are shit, never mind, I'm just going to kill you all. It's like, you're just better. You're killing the planet. I'd rather just have the planet. Like,
Yeah.
Something like that.
Sounds pretty reasonable.
I mean, that's the problem is there is a really good argument for humans being like cancer on the planet,
Yeah.
right? So you don't want the AI thinking that.
Yeah.
Agent Smith style.
Right.
The virus.
Yeah, I think it's like I think some psychology could definitely get into that kind of way of like thinking too, because we like to think that like you brought up the idea that like humans like also have like some values that they're probably working off of, or at least like base motivations that are happening. But I think that even that can be like questioned a lot of the time, because you get people who like would do like self-harm, or people who are in like bad state, like schizophrenic states
Right.
and stuff like that. Probably schizophrenic would be more related to like if there was like a virus in the AI that messed up with
I
some
mean,
of
that
those.
is the thing. Like, intelligence doesn't necessarily mean you can't have mental disabilities, right?
Exactly.
So there could
Yeah.
be a super
Exactly.
intelligent schizophrenic AI or bipolar AI.
Well, I think
or
most
something like-
geniuses, or what you would call a genius, have been neurotics.
That's
They've
true.
had various kinds of abnormal mental conditions.
Right. So true.
It's
And I think a lot of
Interesting.
times that high intelligence and that divergent thinking causes those
Yeah,
mental
exactly.
disabilities,
Yeah.
It's interesting though, because like I feel like I definitely fall into the trap of trying to anthropomorphize AI a lot of the time.
Yeah.
And it's interesting to think about a machine that like maybe I don't understand it well enough to say that it wouldn't have some sort of like limbic system or even like amygdala type thing going
Right.
on where they like it could experience its own version of emotions.
So if we
and
give it an
feelings
id,
and needs.
essentially.
Yeah, essentially. But it also seems weird that it would to me. Like, it
Yeah.
seems more likely that it's
I'm
not
not
going to
even-
have that kind of
I'm saying
going
it's
on.
either that is a very good thing, or it is an incredibly bad thing.
Right. That's
Because
why
I think the moral thing that is kind of that would be the Olympics.
Well, I think
that's
it's
why
probably
the
both.
humans, like that's why like Musk and Kurzweil want humans to be the limbic system of AI.
Yes.
That's the idea of having like constant connection.
It's just
with
an
it.
extension of our
Yeah.
cognitive
So
abilities
it's just
serving
raw
our aid.
intelligence.
Yeah. Yeah.
So that's sort of right now
Yeah.
the best case scenario of anyone that actually like has an idea of how this could go well.
Yeah.
Right.
Is for that to happen.
Yeah, it's interesting the problems that Sam Harris brings up with that though as well, of how like in order for that to happen, you have to have also gotten, so you have to have like
The
the neuroscience done so that you can actually link that together, and then also have made AI. And so by that, like, you've made this AI somehow separate already,
Right.
probably. I mean,
Well, that's why like Musk is pushing now all his resources towards Neuralink. Or not all of his, but like he gave up on like the AI side of it, and now he's focused on Neuralink as the solution because he doesn't think
To
we
pair it with
right. Because
yeah.
he thinks we have to get that tech up, like the exact problem he's saying here. We have to get that tech up way faster if we're going to be able to get like a good connection with them
Right.
before we have AGI.
Right.
So that's why he thinks that is. And Kurzweil has a similar view, but Kurzweil, I don't know if he's the director of engineering at Google, so he's invented a ton of stuff, and he's very much into like the idea that inventions, you have to be at the right time for them.
Yeah.
And he thinks that essentially it's by his model, he thinks it's basically inevitable that we'll essentially get that invention within the same time frame as AI or whatever. So he's like really
That'd be
confident
nice.
that we'll have. Yeah, I don't know that. Like,
That seems like putting it on faith a lot.
right. Yeah, I don't know that he has enough grounding for that belief.
Yeah.
But just so you know, like what the
I have
major position.
an interesting question about that. What do you think of the possibility of, so like let's say for like a small thought experiment that we do get the uplink capability in terms of the neuroscience down. What do you think about that, like merging of our intelligence with some sort of other intelligence being kind of the jump start of like getting over the hump of, the AI is not necessarily as
Right.
good at rewriting itself to like now it's piggybacking on some really smart
Yeah.
person,
So that's-
and you can actually like
That's called collective intelligence. So that book, Super Intelligence, that Nick Bostrom wrote, he divides intelligence into super intelligence into different
Get in the
categories.
weeds here.
So you can have the like specific like single computer of AGI, or you can have a collective intelligence, which could happen different ways, right? But it's just the idea that all of humanity's intelligence together becomes
Interesting.
super intelligent because we're so interconnected, or maybe we've done genetic modification
Okay.
and stuff like
yeah.
So there are different paths to super intelligence. The most likely path most people feel is the like single AI, which there's a bunch of different ways that could happen too, right? It could be a neural network architecture. There's seed AIs that some people think could happen, but it's really unlikely since no one's found one. The seed AI means you just write a program, push a button, and suddenly it became a self-thinking AI,
Yeah.
like just by a few lines of code. Like you just have to figure out that holy grail of code.
That'd be
So where like a
insane.
neural
The other way is
network
the machine work.
Yeah,
learning.
a neural network is like the machine learning closer
Okay.
to what we learn. We just feed it a bunch of data. We don't really understand how it learns anything, but we fed it a bunch of data and now it knows the answers.
Right.
But collective intelligence is, that's definitely that's one of the arguments for the fact that super intelligence is even more inevitable than AGI more specifically, because even if we for some reason can't make a specific super intelligent computer individually, we can definitely eventually get more and more connected. I mean, we're already moving in that direction,
Yeah.
even without the brain helmets. As we get more connected,
Right, even social
society-
media is kind of like a primitive precursor to that.
Exactly.
Yeah.
What were you gonna say about that though, Drew?
The reason why I hesitate a lot with the idea of even super intelligence is because trying to figure out how individuals link or come to conclusions, link information so that they can come to conclusions is I think a lot of us like to think of that as intelligence. But that also implies a lot, because it's all about reference and coming to your conclusion based off certain premises. But if you're literally in a different environment or around different people, there are people who will come up to a different conclusion for the same exact question, right? So it seems as though I wouldn't say that their intelligence is something that's different there. I would say that their base motives that they're working off of, the premises, are the things that have changed.
So what's your point there then?
Are you saying that the linking of people in and of itself will change the nature of their thoughts in a way that could be limiting? Is that what you're kind of saying?
Well, in a way that can be
It's gonna eliminate...
really important. I just think that if we want it to understand us, I feel like the super intelligence part is only one piece of it.
Oh yeah, for sure. I mean, they're definitely
Right.
those are divorced problems. The idea of super intelligence is that it can be completely cold. It doesn't have to have any kind of understanding of our values. That's some people hope that maybe that's the answer, is that we need to make it so that it attempts to find our values. But there's certainly a lot of problems that you're bringing up there of raw intelligence doesn't necessarily get you to values, because depends on your environment and all kinds of things.
Because mine is just the
one
core
quick clarification.
Oh, yeah.
Are we talking about the AGI that's separate from humans here, or the AGI that, or a
integrated.
integrated collective intelligence?
And
Which one are we
overall,
talking
I
about?
was really talking about intelligence in general. But yeah, I mean, I guess in this case, it would be, I would need to know what they're saying about the general intelligence, because it seems as though
Are you
The
wondering
separate
how intelligence is defined? Because they're using the really pedantic version that like G,
Yeah, so that's what I mean is IQ, that thing, that rarely changes depending on your environment.
Mhm.
But what I'm saying is that depending on your environment, the premises that you're going to be using those are very variable, because it depends on what you're doing.
Yeah.
So what I'm saying is that to have it be divorced, I guess, would be to
Like the
divorce from
separate from us?
Yeah, exactly.
Physically?
Yeah, that would be. I'm wondering what that would even what the implications of that would be, only because there's all of this other brain information that is not being taken into consideration, the idea of the hippocampus being able to be basically the center of the unification of past events, other learning situations where you can take in different sensory data. It's does it have a hippocampus? Does it have an amygdala? Does it have this? Or is it literally just a prefrontal cortex? And then if that's true, it's what does that, is that what we're creating as AGI? Is that AGI? Or does it have the idea of another thing that came to my mind was storage. So yeah, you have incredible amounts of intelligence, but if you just strap on this crazier prefrontal cortex and your brain hasn't adapted to it, is that gonna be something crazy? You're able to process a bunch of information now quicker, but does that also make it so that all of your dopamine system is now firing way quicker than it should be, and so you get kind of Parkinson's disease?
So now you're
which
talking
happens.
back about integrating it with humans?
Yeah, I get, yeah.
Okay.
So, because that would be I guess, That would be the Neuralink kind of thing. Is that AGI? Or is that... Because I thought that was the super...
I thought AGI was just
So
like...
AGI specifically just means a general intelligence, independent of humanity.
Right.
So it could exist in this computer, right?
Not connected at all to us.
Not necessarily.
Okay.
It could be.
Okay.
So the thing is with Neuralink, we could be connected into an AGI system.
Neuralink is
okay.
the bridge, but AGI is
Right.
just the capacity.
But we could also not have AGI and just have Neuralink and be connected to each other. And that's where we get just a collective intelligence from.
Okay.
Collective
See,
thinking.
that's interesting too. That's a trip.
So
That's
AGI
for
seems
sure.
to me like a creation of like another brain. Where it would
To
have
an
a
extent.
storage.
I mean, that's essentially how current AGI is developed, or not AGI, current narrow AI is developed, is, neural networks, which is
Mhm.
basically all, based off of brain models.
Yeah.
Totally.
We can't really identify, like, centers of the brain, because, like, essentially it's just a black box to us. Like,
Totally.
We sort of know that it's formatted the way that we think neurons work to an extent.
Mhm, yeah.
But, we just give it data on one end, and then we have an algorithm, which there's some nuance as to different ways to actually implement neural networks and stuff. And there's, like, back propagation where you can use
Yeah.
calculus to go. So, but yeah, there's.
I'm just like it comes to me even in like the effect of like, are we taking into consideration what it would be to integrate this kind of intelligence? Because I think that like it's that same idea of like let's say like someone on cocaine, they can think a lot quicker than everything else, but that does put stress on the body.
Right.
Sure.
And anytime you actually get into a state at which your adrenaline's going and your brain is processing quicker, that's not a good state. I mean, it is for the moment.
Sure.
But that's
right?
because our biology causes those limitations. So, like with a computer,
Totally.
that's the anthropomorphizing.
Exactly.
aspect, is that it won't have any of those.
Yeah,
limitations.
But like that's also if you're talking about specifically with like neural uplink.
Exactly. That's
in that
like
case, yeah, that's part of the whole science behind getting that to actually work. Is like we have to make sure that it's not like running your your computer on like what do they call that when you like run your drives like overdrive, is that what they call it, where it's like going overclock? Yeah, it's not like overclocking your brain to the point where you're gonna burn yourself up in 10 years instead of maybe the 50 you might have had otherwise.
Totally.
So we have to obviously do enough research to where we know that's not gonna happen.
Totally.
From that.
Well, then I also worry about what are we going to use AI for? Because
Right.
that idea, it seems as though, well,
And that was like what you remember Sam Harris's talk. He was like, even if you get it perfectly handed to you, how the hell do you make society function?
Exactly.
See, I'm worried about so many things, but I mean, one of the big things I'm worried about is it's going to lead to the rise in more authoritarian forms of government. I mean, just think about the fact of like the kind of mass data collection we're doing right now with
Harari's
spying.
talk on fascism recently?
No.
He did a TED talk just a few months ago. And he was saying that the control of data flow could lead to the rise of fascism.
I agree.
Because the big thing with previous fascism regimes, right, is that like they try to centralize too much stuff and it doesn't
work.
Right.
But now AI. See, there's multiple things with this. So first of all, there's this whole other train of thought right now in economics about how China is getting more and more scary because the viability of a communist state with the assistance of AI and a central planned economic system with AI helping it, it's a lot more viable now.
Sure.
And so when you pair that with an authoritarian government, I mean, that's a powerhouse, and it's terrifying.
That is terrifying.
And so there's that whole thing. I'm really worried about the United States, too. I mean, we have the biggest spying complex of any country. And when you take that massive amount of data and you give it to AI to analyze, to categorize, to put people into groups based off different characteristics.
Minority Report.
That's exactly right.
Oh, boy. Oh, boy, oh, boy. I mean, the ability of the population to resist a tyrannical government is going to be absolutely crippled.
Yeah, and that's what Harari was saying too, is like, you won't even want to resist. That's the thing. They're going to have so much data that they know you better than you know yourself, and they're going to emotionally manipulate you to think that you love the dictator.
See,
right?
I mean, that's part of what they're doing right now in China is they have this new thing they recently unrolled, which is like a citizen rating system. So they have cameras all over the place in China, right? And they're just using basic facial recognition. Like, this is low-level shit. They're using facial recognition to track you, whenever you're in public, where you're going, all these things. And you have, like, a citizen rating system.
You gotta watch that video.
Depending on, your views, how you behave. Right. And, if your rank goes down, it's gonna be shit like you lose your
Can't use
credit
your
score.
bus and shit.
Yeah, you
like,
can't use
that
the
gets
bus.
into
If it gets
black
bad
mirror,
enough, they
right?
strip you of your
Sweeping
passport.
Yeah.
I mean, we're
Yeah.
seeing where this is going.
It's like
It's-
making you a prisoner
Yeah.
to an extent.
yeah,
Yeah,
it's scary.
That is super scary, and I mean they're also this is slightly related the whole like Google Dragonfly directive of have you heard about that where they're making a Google that will specifically
to work in
censor
China.
stuff in
Oh,
China where like
right.
certain Google searches will be directed in different
Okay,
ways and stuff
this
like
is
that.
something that's really freaking me out lately. Is there's this huge new censorship push in the United States due to all the political turmoil going on.
Oh,
They're
shit.
pressuring Facebook. They're pressuring Google. It's starting to happen. Like they took Alex Jones down. That's how
Yeah.
it starts,
Yeah.
and it's getting worse and worse. And I mean, I just saw the number 2 from Facebook go and talk before Congress. And I mean, this Republican senator Tom Cotton, he was essentially being like, you know, we want you to take WikiLeaks down. And we want you to assist us in, you know, targeting our adversaries in Iran and China and Russia and Korea. And so, I mean, the government's pushing for this, and we know that these companies don't have principles.
Right.
Yeah.
Because the fact that Google's going to work in China
Yeah.
Yeah.
means that if the profit's there, they're going to go. So the only variable is, will they be bullied into it by the government, and the government's trying. So, I don't like
That's
it.
super scary.
Yeah, for real.
Yeah. Anyway.
Anyway, I think this is a good place for a break.
Break.
So we can all bathroom break and water and whatever we need. I have to pee.
You know what? You go first, Dwight.
Oh, thanks.
Hey, Rupert.
Hey, Rupert.
He sure likes his little corner. Ooh, good shit. Good shit, boys.
I like when I walked away to get the water. I thought I was just like, I'm not sure I really contributed anything other than like
Oh, yes.
with the whole AI. I worry sometimes that I go on like these kind of tangents where like I get like kind of like locked into this thing and just like go for
But it
it.
did happen when I was listening to the first one we did.
Yeah.
It did happen a bit.
Yeah.
Another thing, which I noticed you were doing better on this time, is you said like probably like every 4th word
Really?
for most of that first podcast.
Yeah.
It was
Yeah.
pretty trippy. But
I would say the only thing was like I felt like you were jumping between two different things, and it was a little hard to like track.
yeah, that's something we should all probably put effort into. Is like the audience wants to have like a clear line of thought.
I know, and
You
now
know?
it's like-
And it's hard because, especially because we've all been friends for so long, that it's like we have all these pre-hatched discussions, and so it's so easy to be like, oh, this thing that we both know about already. And
Well,
so,
that's one of the things I think is really good for like that whole like the grounding of being able to read something before, or just like the facts in general. Just being like,
Yeah.
this is a fact, not
have
just
some more prep work.
yeah,
Yeah.
not just for like sourcing, but also for like we're talking about this, right? You know.
Well, Dwight's got the laptop. We should be like, pull that shit up, Dwight.
Hey, that's what I'm here for. What were we trying to say?
I was noticing like when I like went into the tangent of like how like AI goes in like it will affect our brains. That was like I was like that seems very pointed. That's like a very like pointed like one piece of an argument that we could be having on just like how it might like it's an example, but it was like a feeling it out example.
Discussion on its own.
Yeah, and I don't want to like hop off of like another topic. Just,
Sure.
But
It's nice to do that sometimes, but it's also nice to try and like finish one thought and go to the next.
I got caught in that because I was like it was like trying to coordinate everything I do know about like the brain. It was really I always worry about like that. It was the same thing like I heard about like these drugs that people are taking in order to like up their it's basically like microdosing LSD, that kind of idea, except there's other drugs that will help to improve your intelligence is like what they're supposed to say. And that like worried me because I feel like there's so many implications of like you getting addicted to that, or like what happens to your personality if you like take a step out of that and don't have it for a little while. Are you like a completely different person now because now you're categorized, you're able to file through things at different speeds. And now I feel like that kind of stuff I think people are like, we'll be more intelligent, and it's like I don't know if that's good.
Humanity, though?
Yeah.
So, like, the 3 main things I'm really interested to talk about at some point during this is, so one is allowing this technology to kind of like change what human life is without having a conversation about it first, and actually kind of like being like, what do we want human life to be? What is sacred to us? What do we want to keep and have AI facilitate as opposed to overrun? Yeah. And then the other thing is alternative economic models with an AI world. So like I really want to talk about universal income, pros and cons of that. Sure. And then I also really want to talk about democratic cooperatives, because I heard you don't think that would work. That's like one of my big things, so I'm stoked to talk about that too. But just generally alternative economic models in the face of AI and climate change. And
I love heterodox economics.
What's that?
I love heterodox economics. Like,
What's that word?
That just means anything that's not Keynesian, basically. Like,
Yeah, no.
It's not approved.
Definitely, good, because I'm all about that too.
Yeah. You guys have
Keynes is a very
No, I've been doing it forever.
Yeah, I know. You're a leaky man.
I'm over Keynesian classical myself. What do you think? What would you call like your economic philosophy?
I don't think anyone's actually came out with a good terminology for it yet. It's closer to what Eric Weinstein advocates, which is sort of like I'd say like a baseline of socialism with like an Austrian like free market on top, but with the constraint that within that free market, what we consider violence is much more clearly defined. Like anything that damages the call it the ecosystem is violence, and that needs to be regulated.
Totally.
All right, so we're back without an introduction, but yeah, economic
And
models.
unbreak.
Talking about economic models. So please continue, whatever you're saying.
That was just the basic. Like, I mean, I get a lot more. Like, so I think public welfare programs are more important right now than like actual socialism. I don't want to see the government like seizing assets from people, but I think things like universal health care from a perspective
Yeah,
of like Medicare
that's
for
very
all
different.
is really important.
Or universal education.
Exactly. Yeah, all those kind of things. Like any things that we think of as universal, but that doesn't require the government to go out and actually take people's things from them and say, now I own this.
Like Medicare for all, it's you still have private, medical companies, and you're just paying taxes to the government, and then they foot the bill, and they negotiate prices, which keep prices down, and all that shit.
Yeah.
I think, like, for me, one of the things I was talking about with my friend Jason, because we were talking a little bit about this, and I wanted to center my own personal ideas, to center it in its economics.
Jason, the
philosopher? Yeah.
He's getting his PhD in philosophy.
Yeah, and environmental science.
Nice.
That's a good combo.
Yeah. And, like, the idea was, the only reason why I wanted to choose the university was because it was housed in a place where it was, we were talking about this a little, like, the other night, but, it's housed in the, want for knowledge, want for truth, and, I think it would be a good place to be able to, counter corruption. But, one of the things that I find so interesting is it seems as though we want these systems so that they can organize things better, right? That's the whole idea for me about creating a system is we all have agreed that not one of us is able to say this is how everything's going to happen. We're not going to do it in this kind of commander or authoritarian way. We want it to have these other systems that all interplay and create a better organization of ourselves so that people can become better people and individuals can become better individuals, but also so that they don't infringe on everyone else's ability to do so, right? But even though that I feel is an implicit idea of when we go and try to structure these things, I think a lot of people have that implicit value in them. I don't think that people critically use that as a way to judge our systems right now. Because I don't think that you can look at our systems right now and from all of the information that we have say this is the best system. And yet
and not in any area either. I mean, that's the thing. You can look at any individual system and say we have so much we could do to make this better.
And the shitty part about that too is I think in almost any system that's probably going to be true regardless. We're probably never going to get to a point where we're this is perfect. Right? But the issue that I see with that is that I don't see a lot of improvement. We're not trying to make it better in a lot of ways, it seems like.
To me, I think that's probably a symptom of the concentration of power. I mean, if you have embedded power structures that obviously like the status quo because it's made them powerful, then they're going to use their power just to perpetuate what exists.
And that's why I want to, like, that's why I think the big thing, you bring up efficiency, like, that was, like, that whole idea is to, like, improve towards that goal. But what I'm saying is that I don't even know, because I think the goal is so implicit right now, is, like, because it's not explicit, people can't, like, critically think about our systems and be like, wait, are those even the values that they're working off of anymore? Because I don't think that's true. I don't think that they're working off of kind of the values that we set forth of like trying to improve everything and organize things better so that everyone can benefit. I don't think that's at all.
There's a lot of these core problems. I mean, when you think about the idea of like that we could face a situation where we just have a bunch of really wealthy people with AI and no one has jobs, I mean, that invalidates the whole underlying reason for having an economic system, which is to provide work and a livelihood for the mass of people. I mean, when you're a regular person and you say, what's the point of the economic system? It's, well, to create a good life for everyone, to create a good society.
You would think.
And if we reach a point where there's literally no work for people, then that invalidates like the whole purpose, ostensibly. Because now you're saying, okay, well, was the real purpose just to make a few people really powerful?
Exactly. And that's, I think that would be...
I would argue there's some real truth in that.
I wouldn't localize that in just the economic system, the idea of like making a better life for everyone. I think that that's more of a society in general thing.
There's a lot of overlapping, but economics is certainly a huge part of people's lives. I mean, 9 to 5, you're interacting with the economic system at least.
What is it, 80,000 hours? Is that right?
Right, that's how many hours you work in the average lifetime.
Because to me it seems
certainly
as
a big
though...
chunk of your life.
Really, economics impacts you from every other direction too. Your shopping and even everything that's
well, and now you're seeing, I mean, even the political system, which is supposed to be kind of a counterbalance to other things. You're supposed to be able to exercise your political system to change some other things.
Right.
That was what
if that gets seized by the economic system...
Well, now we have crony capitalism, where the government's in bed with these big businesses and stuff, and essentially the businesses write laws in order to impede more businesses from being able to come in and compete.
Well, that's kind of the natural development of things, and I mean that's happened all throughout our history.
Here's the only reason why, like this, like I think a lot of people have gone down this kind of like pathway too, where they see that there was supposed to be like the government and the economic system; those were supposed to be separate, and the government was supposed to keep the economic system in check with laws. Really, it was like the big idea. But now the economic system was like, hey, what if we just pay the people in the government to just do whatever we want, and now there's no laws to constrain us?
Well, this gets back to, in my view, Cicero. Because the whole thing of okay, so Cicero in Rome talked about how in order to have, he was around when Caesar came to power, and he was talking about how if we could redo Rome, the way I would do it so that the public would survive is you need to have 3 check and balance powers within the society. You would have democracy, that's one of them, aristocracy or wealth, that's another, and then monarchy or the government, that's another. And he said you need all 3 of these to have equal power within the society so they check each other, because each one of them devolves if it's left unchecked. Government turns into tyranny, aristocracy turns into oligarchy, democracy turns into mob rule. And so what we had in America was, very early on, it was tilted in favor of the aristocracy. And as that got really powerful with the industrialization, you have all these big monopolies, government goes, oh shit, they're running away with the society and we need to check them. So starting with Teddy Roosevelt, you had the government get way bigger to try and check corporate power. But then eventually, they had a tug of war one-on-one, which means one of them's going to win, because there's not that third... check to keep it balanced.
Well, the monarchy.
And now you've had the wealth seize control of the majority of the political system.
That monarchy check, I feel like, is super difficult in kind of our mindset as Americans to have that.
Well, right, but the president, government, but.
And I do get the president is supposed to that's supposed to be the monarchy.
And well, see the way the founding fathers drew a lot of inspiration from Cicero, and they talked about. They tried to exemplify those things within institutions. So when Cicero talked about it as the dynamic of power. So rather than there's an institution that represents that power, it's more like, no. How much power do the people have? How much power does wealth have? How much power does the government have? Holistically, taking into account all the ways that they can influence things.
Totally.
The founding fathers made it so the president was supposed to represent the monarchy in this concept. The Senate was supposed to represent the aristocracy. And remember, at this time, the Senate was not voted. You were selected by government officials. We didn't get to vote on the Senate till like 1912 or something like that. And then the House of Representatives was supposed to represent the people, the democracy, because it was way easier to become a member of the House of Representatives. But, I mean, those institutions were not accurate representations of that power within the society. You know, the House of Representatives wasn't a wholly owned expression of the will of the people.
Right.
You know, and so...
Bunch of white dudes.
Yeah.
At first.
Very quickly, the aristocracy became the most powerful.
The only reason why I was like trying to break it down into I can kind of see. I would probably have to read more Cicero for that because I do get.
We didn't get super far into it.
Because how is the monarchy like? I think the monarchy would probably be more of a like societally influential person. I don't know. It's hard. Like, how do you? What is a king gets to do whatever the fuck he wants, really, unless they all decide to revolt. And
well, but this isn't. That's the whole premise: is that monarchy alone would be a king that gets to do whatever he wants. There's a lot of mixed king systems. Like, for example, like when the French Revolution was unfolding, there was the idea for a while that we'd have a constitutional monarchy where you have a king, but there's a constitution, and he can't violate the constitution. And, you know, the judges and the royalty could, you know, stop him from doing things because he broke the constitutional law. So... Interesting.
So then they also divorce law from that? They divorce law from the government?
What do you mean?
Like, who keeps the... Does the government keep the... this would be... Yeah.
It gets very convoluted. There's all these different checks and then even in the American system you have like that system that was based off Cicero, but then you have the further out checks and balances of like the Supreme Court plus Congress plus the presidency. So it gets really convoluted. But anyway.
I guess from like my main thing is like we see that both like the economic system and government influence each other, and right now it doesn't seem like they're very much separate from each other. Yeah. And so
Which is scary because that's kind of the definition of fascism.
Well, also I feel like it could be also of really any like socialism too.
Well, my personal take on socialism is a libertarian socialism, which is not based in government doing things. It's based in
no state ownership.
No. It's workers owning and running the businesses themselves. So it's a grassroots socialism.
1913 is when.
Oh, 1 year off.
Were able to be elected in the privacy of a voting booth, at least. So that's according to the Senate.gov or Senate.gov.
That's so weird that we don't know that. But not until the 1900s did we even vote for our senators.
It is weird.
But anyway.
Yeah.
Well, I don't think we know the underlying structure. I think I'm showing that personally right now. All of mine is like mine's like intuitions of like what I've seen, but yeah, I have no idea like where it is that, because the whole idea is like if you have a well-structured system, you can be like, okay, well, what were the goals of this system in the first place? Right here.
It feels to me like you're advocating for a kind of like a merging of the political and economic systems, but in a way that was benevolent.
I'm not advocating for it. I'm saying that that's what's happened, and so
you just want it to exert that power for good.
It's. I mean, I would like to, yeah. If that's our only option.
Was that your position? Because like my position is that will never happen because that concentration of power is inherently corrupting and self-serving, and so I think it has to be dismantled.
Yeah, I mean, it would depend. I could see that as being the way, but I would also say that like the other way is so that the government is now actually like truly like democratic too. So you'd have to
see, but if it's merged with the economic system, I don't think it can be.
Right.
Unless the economic system is democratic. Here we go.
Exactly. Well, if you merged them, then if one was democratic, then the other would have to be democratic too.
Well, one will have to take over the other. I think we had
I don't think that's
a political... I think so, because what we have now is a political system that had democratic aspects to it. I never think it was very democratic. Mm-hmm. And then you have an authoritarian economic system. And if those two things are going to duke it out, one I think is going to have influence the other, spread its aspects to the other one. It's going to be the primary role. So I think we've now developed a more authoritarian government because of the influence that our economic system has over the government.
Well, I guess I definitely see that, but I see that through through money, right? Like the effect is that the economic system, there's been people who have gotten so wealthy that they are now more influential on our quote unquote democratic government system, right? Than we can be as the actual democracy. And so the way that I would say that is we say that that's a thing, not okay, right? And then you have to use that same channel of law system making to be yo,
well, how do you make laws if the legislature's already captured?
Well, you have to put some way of pressure, right? You would have to pressure them somehow.
What do you think about that, Chris? What do you think? What are your views
Which
on that kind of
aspect?
stuff?
Yeah, you were listening a lot. Just give us a whole.
So
What did all that make you think of?
well, libertarian socialism was kind of the main.
That's certainly where I'm
thing,
coming
but
from.
I could tell,
Yeah.
and he mentioned to me that you like Chomsky, so that
Oh,
I was
love me some
expecting-
Chomsky.
I was expecting that one to come up. I really like the ideas of libertarian socialism. I feel and I think this may be where you're coming from, but it's just a little too impractical. The structures are already
That's what a lot of
there,
people think.
and
Yeah.
how are you going to convince those people now to just give up all their power and give all the resources?
Okay, so there's two discussions here. There's what would a system like this look like theoretically, and would it be better? And then there's the tactics of how do you achieve it, how do you get to it. So that's kind of the point you're bringing up.
And my point is I think that as a system, like a lot of different sort of utopian systems like communism or pure Austrian system, if you could have a ground up and just make this poof out of nowhere,
Sure.
it would work.
Yeah.
But the idea of getting from where we are now to there is just so impractical.
Totally.
And there's so many different things that could be corrupted within that process that it could go worse. We could end up in a much worse place trying to move that way. Just what happens with communism. A lot of people have tried to do communism or state socialism in a positive way. But even going back to Russia, you can argue that a lot of the people that pushed for the communist revolution weren't as corrupt about it as Stalin was. But then Stalin, despite no one wanting Stalin to be there.
Well, and there's
Stalin
a lot of
got in
lessons
charge.
there.
Right.
I mean, I think the core problem there was thinking that any concentration of power could be used for the benefit of society without risk of it being captured.
Right.
So, I mean, I think first and foremost, the first lesson there is the solution has to be decentralized, because we tried a centralized solution and it was immediately captured by authoritarians. So that's kind of my first basis of my point of view. As far as ways to get there, so obviously I'd prefer an economy that was entirely democratic, but I understand that the transition to something like that is going to be really tough. So my first idea is to argue for creating a democratic sector within the economy. So I'm aiming for 50% democratic businesses. And then once you have that on its feet, you allow that to compete.
It's a pretty massive jump.
Oh, I know. Obviously, I'm just throwing that out there as the aspiration.
Okay.
So here's some examples of concrete policies that are being thought of right now to deal with this. So right now, Jeremy Corbyn, who is the opposition leader in Britain, he's the head of the Labour Party, one of his platform positions is to create a democratic sector within the economy of democratic cooperatives. And the way they would facilitate this is they would create a new law that says whenever a business would either sell off a location or go public, they would first have to offer right of first refusal to the employees to buy out the business and run it democratically. And if the employees decide to do it, the government will provide the loan, the startup capital, and informational assistance to facilitate that transition and to become functioning before they pay it back. So that's one idea, and there's a lot of different ideas.
It's
For
an
example,
interesting idea. The
Yeah.
problem is there's no empirical evidence to support that would work, and that when people buy it, it's just like if Walmart.
that the
if we let
democratic cooperative itself would work.
Well, on a small scale, but I'm saying let's imagine putting that into practice.
Right.
And let's say that Walmart allow all the employees of Walmart the chance to buy it.
Yeah.
A week later, Walmart is out of business. Okay, there's just a lot of industries where the average person has no idea what's happening.
That's
the
true.
bulk of this company is made of people that are just average, and that's the most industries in the world.
But I think that's also part of the system is it keeps them in that position of averageness. You
Well,
know what
like,
I mean?
okay, so do you think IQ doesn't exist? If you have someone with a 90
No, I do
IQ,
think it exists.
Okay, then like Walmart, the average IQ of a
Right.
Walmart employee is 90. How are you going to change that system to be to where these people can have a
So,
democratic co-op?
in most of these democratic cooperative models, how it works is they're still managers, but you elect your managers.
Right, but the people electing it don't understand what they're electing, so that's how you get Trump. You just get someone saying, "Oh, I'll give you all the big league wins and you'll
Right.
get pay raises."
But
and
that's
you'll
the
be
whole
manager."
idea of like there's still going to be the impact of the market. So
Right, which is what I'm saying. You,
Right.
you initiate this,
Right.
this happens, company collapses, which is why they don't exist in practice and why they need to be subsidized to start with. Because if you try to do this in the real world, it collapses. and
not
that's why
all
we have the
there's
system
there's
we
a
have.
lot of examples of it do work
On
in
a
the real
very
world.
small scale.
Not no
Give me
the
1,000
seventh
companies.
largest corporation in Spain is a democratic cooperative.
One company in Spain.
Well, this
How
is the
big
biggest
is
one.
this?
It's got, I think, what did it say? It was, I think, over 100,000 employees. So that's the biggest one in the world. It's over 100,000 employees, and it started up all on its own. It didn't have any funding, but it worked for whatever reason. And I mean, it's an absolute insane
What kind of industry?
success story. It's a lot of different things. So it's an umbrella corporation. So it's got like
So are the people
manufacturing.
like
it's got
Google level?
grocery
Are we
stores.
talking about like a Google type of people where the average person's got like a 145 IQ?
I have no idea about the IQ.
I think that
of
the-
That's
employees.
very
well-
important, though. If we're talking about Google, Google can 100% run a democratic co-op
Right.
because you've got a bunch of geniuses
Yeah.
making a decision. Walmart cannot.
From what he's told me, they have people from like GM and stuff. The
So they have their own
trained by
they
these
have
people,
their own labs
so-
as part of the corporation, and it's GM and what was the other one? I wrote
Right.
it
So
down.
my point is that it works in certain specific incidents, but it doesn't scale across the whole economy because you can't take that same model and apply it to Walmart or the vast majority of industries. You can take an
See,
industry-
but here's another argument: is I would say Walmart shouldn't exist anyway because it's. I mean, I think it's a type of business that is. I mean, we subsidize. It pays its employees so little that we have to subsidize it with public assistance.
Sure, but
and
take any other
destroys
business. I
local
just picked
communities.
One random example. I mean, you can pick
Amazon
McDonald's or-
does that too, though.
Huh? Yeah,
Amazon.
Amazon. I mean, pick any company is my
Yeah.
point, though, is that, I mean, yeah, there's a big problem with subsidizing, and you can
Yeah.
argue that that's part of the issue with the government and the way that those programs are structured
Right.
to start with, but
Right.
that doesn't necessarily mean that the model that they're using creates that problem.
Yeah, it might be that there's another solution to that, like the universal income.
Right.
Right,
For
that's
sure.
that's my personal, like, at the moment, I think we still need a lot of discussion with universal income,
Yeah.
but I think that's the direction we really have to move is, and like, well, have you heard of Andrew Yang,
No.
the Democratic candidate? So he's a Democratic candidate for 2020.
Oh, Yang.
Before we get into the universal basic income, I'd like to talk a little bit more about the IQ of running, like the IQ of the average person running some sort of democratic entity.
Mm-hmm.
So how do you confront that problem in the government that we have? Because like most people would say that some sort of democratic
I'd say that's the
governance
problem with our
is-
government. Why we have Trump as president is because the average IQ of an
So-
American isn't that high.
Well,
The issue
but
then is
I mean,
what
he
do we
didn't even
do?
get the majority of the votes. So
That's
I mean,
true,
that's
too.
not necessarily representative of a democratic function.
Right, and there's a lot of issues with that whole aspect of the system.
Yeah.
But then you can also argue, tyranny of the majority and the fact that,
True.
population centers tend to be the vote, so they have homogenous.
Okay, well now we're really getting to the thing is, what's better, a kind of a more authoritarian, idealistically a meritocratic system or a democratic system?
So meritocracy
Right.
is what I'm particularly advocating for, not
See-
necessarily authoritarian
Right.
meritocracy.
Right. But I think that's kind of I agree with you, meritocracy, but again, I think meritocracy is one of those things where it looks better on paper than in practice.
But if you stop with meritocracy, just all progress stops. You can't find an example.
Oh, I
of society
agree.
It was like we didn't really care. Like take Genghis Khan. He was the first guy that was just like 100% meritocracy. Now I own half the world. Like it's just effective. You can say it's
It is
easy
effective,
moral in
but
some ways,
a lot
you're
of
gonna lose
times-
to the person who's
Yes.
building with that system every time.
I think a lot of times meritocracy is kind of used as a justification for what really is just concentration of power. I think a lot of people.
in some cases.
Well,
Yeah.
and that's an interesting thing is like when you do have a meritocracy, you you end up with huge concentrations of power because there are certain individuals that are significantly better than everybody else.
Like
For whatever
Elon
reason.
Musk, like, you know, he just out.
But that power it's not like, you know, you have to go through this rigorous process to determine if you're fit to wield that power. That power passes through families.
Oh, well, yeah, now that's
You
a
know,
big issue is how much wealth is passed
That's what I
through
was gonna
families.
bring.
That's a
Most
big
wealth
problem.
in this country is passed through the
Exactly.
family structure.
We don't even know where the wealth is.
And that has
because
nothing to do with meritocracy.
Yeah.
And it's not like we have a system where people's wealth that they generate is equivalent to their merit or their skill. I mean,
Right.
you know, and the fact that it's getting more and more unequal. I mean, how many people in this country are poor and they're brilliant and they never got a chance in life, you know? So, I mean...
Well, but do you then say, okay, well, we're gonna have everyone take an IQ test, and then
Well,
we're
we do
gonna
that
have...
constantly all the time, but
Well, but what I'm saying is we're gonna have everyone take an IQ test, and then unless you have this IQ, you don't get to be a manager, or if you don't get this.
See,
IQ,
I'm not into
I
that.
don't know about specific positioning like that. Like, I like more of the German system where, like, you can help people find their path as they go.
I love that shit,
Yeah.
but I also worry that that does not solve the problem of families inheriting money.
Oh, for sure.
No, it doesn't.
That's
a
what I'm
whole
saying is
separate
that
problem.
you
Yeah.
like because you.
I mean, that's a problem that none of this has addressed. Like, nothing
No.
we have said is going to take money from the rich people and help anybody else.
Yeah.
That's the whole problem. That's a separate issue.
Okay,
I've
this
not
is-
heard a good solution.
Okay.
Yeah, that's
okay,
hard.
okay.
This is kind of like a totally off topic, and I really want to get back to democratic cooperatives because I have a ton of shit on that, and I want to go into that eventually. But I had this random thought the other day of what if you had a progressive tax system that was linked to inequality of wealth itself? So, like, for example, the higher the inequality of wealth is within the society, the steeper the progressive tax system to try and funnel that back into the economy.
Yeah, it makes sense. Yeah.
It literally a parody, kind of like if you paired, you know, if you paired minimum wage to inflation.
Right. The biggest problem we still have with taxes is what we just hinted on, is that most wealth is hidden
Yeah.
and already
Offshore
taxed. We
shit
can't
and
tax
yeah.
this, you know?
Yeah.
So, like, the richest people are the ones most immune to taxes.
Yeah.
And that's the issue we
Well,
really
they've
have to solve.
essentially executed a tax boycott. I mean, that's what they're doing.
Yeah, and every time, I mean, then they constantly push in government for their taxes to be reduced so they can trickle down or whatever.
Yeah.
You know,
Oh, and now we got to cut public welfare because there's deficit. Or
Right. It's just crazy. But I mean, it's just, that's one of the things where, like, most of the time when we're talking about tax and even businesses, like, a lot of those costs are getting passed through to consumers and
Right.
stuff. And, like, the really wealthy people are just, you know, making bank constantly. And, like, you know, we say Jeff Bezos is the richest man in the world, right? And that's because we can very clearly document where his money comes in because he has a currently traded public business. But all these people, like the Kennedys and stuff, their
Oh, you have
money
no
has
idea.
been hidden so long, we don't know. And, like, a lot of people suspect the richest people in the world are actually in Saudi Arabia. And
Yeah.
the princes there
all
could
that
probably...
all that money.
Yeah, there's a legitimate belief that the first trillionaire could exist in
Hmm.
Saudi Arabia right
Wow.
now.
See?
Yeah. So that, I mean, that's the big problem is how hidden the real problem is. You know what I mean?
Dude, yeah, there's talks with John Kerry, talking before Congress, saying that Saudi Arabia offered to foot the bill if we toppled Syria and shit like that. Like, they said literally if we did a full-on Iraq-style invasion, they'd be willing to just pay for it
Damn. That's crazy.
and just use us as the imperial muscle.
Yeah, exactly. They're just like, you're gonna, your whole military are now mercenaries.
I feel like
Yeah.
they do use us in a way and they manipulate
Yeah,
us.
they
'cause
do.
They funded a lot of the terrorism, which
Yeah.
then got us to come over there
Yeah.
and kill some people they didn't like.
Yeah,
I
both
mean, you know what I
both them and Israel have strong lobbies in the United States
Oh, yeah.
for different reasons.
mean? Right, of course, but yeah.
That is
I mean,
terrifying.
the amount of weapons we trade with Saudi Arabia
Oh, yeah.
every year, just the billions.
Well, right
of
now in
dollars
Yemen,
contract.
I mean, we're just essentially helping them commit a genocide.
Yeah, exactly.
And we're not even talking about it.
Yeah.
I mean, you get a couple senators to put a bill saying we have to stop until Congress says we can do this because it's just totally not spoken of, and they don't even bring it to the floor of Congress. And it's like, wow.
Because people here don't care about it. They want to just have these stupid partisan talking points of like the same arguments that for the past 20 years, the same
Yep.
two.
Well, it's
stupid
hilarious
arguments.
because I mean, I think the scariest things are the places where the two parties agree.
That's fair.
Well, that's
I mean,
like-
the two parties. There's a consensus on war. There's a consensus on corporatism. You know that all these really, a lot of the really shitty stuff. They're in agreement that they don't.
Everybody
talk
loves
about.
Goldman Sachs. Right?
Yeah, yeah. Yeah, how do you vote against Goldman Sachs in the American political system?
Yeah, like Ron Paul, Bernie Sanders,
Yeah.
like the only people
That's
I've
it.
ever seen that.
That's
you
it.
know?
That's insane.
That is. So, what else did you want to say about democratic co-ops?
Oh,
before we
boy.
get too
Okay.
far off of that.
All right, so. Oh, babe. Okay, break.
Hey.
Baby.
Hi. This is Becca,
Oh.
Dan's girlfriend. This is my friend Chris.
Nice to meet you.
How you doing? What'd you bring?
Oh my gosh.
She brought.
So I
food
guess
for
Sean
us.
and Daniel are going camping.
Oh.
She always makes food.
Holy crap, babe. What did you
Is Chrissy on her way? Do you know?
Sure she is.
Okay.
I guess I could try to call her real quick.
Yeah. It's going good. We're getting into all kinds of shit. Mostly AI updates this morning. We're about to get into economics and stuff right now. I am really excited. Oh, my bad. Yeah, I know. I know.
We'll see. I don't know how it turned out.
Amazing. You did it. I do know it. Okay, or die.
But you have to be honest.
She left late. She's still about 3 hours away.
Okay. I'm sure we can find something to do.
I do have to pay attention to time because I work 2:30. No close.
All right.
So
Well,
I just have to-
we'll do democratic co-ops and worship. Thank you for coming.
I'm bringing us amazing
I know.
things. Like,
I keep
by the way,
have to.
hi, here's a bunch of pastries.
I know.
I'm gonna.
Remember when she started coming over and she just brought over a bunch of baked goods?
It's
love it.
all no. I love baking.
I love you baking nipple. There's baked goods, homemade baked goods. Just so you know. Various kinds, not even one.
God damn that woman.
No, please don't. Keep her. Sanctify that woman. I do have to stop in like an hour and a half.
Okay. We knew that going in.
Okay.
We'll try to be more concise.
I love it because I'm gonna be like at work and I'll just be like, hey, what can I get for you? Don't talk to me.
I think that you would sell out. Thank you.
Yeah. You can shirt.
Oh, thanks.
Like a coffee shop?
Wildlife images.
Yeah.
And,
It's we do have like we make sandwiches and stuff and we have pastries and like that kind of stuff, but it's pretty chill. It's a band night tonight though,
mostly
so it might get a little busy like near the end.
for whatever
But
reason were injured or something, and they try to rehabilitate them and let them go.
Gotta do this is worth it.
But you that just they can't let go for various reasons. And so they do a little tour of like if you want to see them.
What kind of
they can't let go.
muffin is this? This is like apple cinnamon?
Yeah, I think so.
What are these?
I really want to get. This is gonna sound stupid now, but I think I need to read more about like social psychology kind of stuff, because
There's a really interesting dude, Jonathan Haidt. I can't remember how to pronounce his name. H-A-I.
You just stay forever.
okay.
He's a social psychologist. that has some pretty interesting work. He's been on Sam Harris's podcast.
Okay.
He has some books and stuff there too, but I know he's done a lot of like independent talks on YouTube you can find. He's interesting. He's the ethical leadership.
Oh wow.
At the Stern New York University Stern School of Business. He's like the ethical leadership professor or whatever. But he has a social psychology, like all of his background in social psychology. So he's focused a lot on like ethics as it relates to politics and like trying to understand the difference between like conservative and liberal.
Wow.
Yeah.
That sounds super fucking
it's
interesting.
Really good stuff. Yeah.
That sounds like, I mean, one of the things that I thought for my PhD would be doing like value-based things, like trying to really like get down what it is that like creates values, and then like
that would be really good because like from the AI standpoint, if you can keep that in your mind, like that could be really important work.
And that was like that was actually like a really big both. So like for me, it's like you have a bunch of like unconscious things that are going on, and then you have your consciousness, which is normally, I feel like, associated mostly with your prefrontal cortex accessing information that is either, because it's kind of like it's like mindfulness in a way where it's like most of the time you don't know you're breathing, or most of the time you don't know your heart's beating, but you can, if you want to, because that information's there, you take your intelligence, and your intelligence can go like, okay, well, let me get that data, okay, now let me try to control it then at that point, you know? And that's, I feel, my best understanding of what the conscious intelligence and consciousness is in general, is being able to access certain data. You can abstract it if you want, but then you like manipulate that data, and you don't even necessarily have to make an action. You can like, because I think imagination also requires a lot of intelligence as well.
Oh, for sure.
And so, like, with that idea in mind, I also, even just for a human, like a life goal, or just like for people, I think it's really important to illuminate those unconscious values that they have, because I think that if you can, if that's data that you can keep in mind, then I think you can actually live a better life by illuminating your values, so that you can act more in accordance with them.
My mother just sent you a new check.
Oh, nice. Money. I need to send Michael his check, because he got a check here. He got a check from Postini's.
For how much?
Because it was like 180.
Oh, wow.
Yeah. So not nothing.
Yeah, not nothing. So, yeah. Becca freaking baking up a feast for no reason.
I know.
I love it. You're just like, one of everything, please.
I have to try them. It's an addiction.
Speaking about sugar.
Yeah, right? Where's the sugar tax? Yeah. Okay.
I'm also planning to save this for Haley. I'm not going to eat all this myself.
No.
I don't know, I say that now, but
Uh-huh.
She gonna be here soon?
whenever. Well, I'll probably tell her to come over after the podcast is over.
This has been going the whole time, so, you know. We may have to do editing, but
Yeah,
I don't
we should
think-
definitely edit this part out.
yeah.
No, I thought I put this right at the front. Muffin.
We should put it right.
Yum.
We should put it right at the front, just so Becca can hear it and be like screaming internally. She has to listen to our compliments. So universal healthcare. We were talking. I mean, not healthcare.
Universal
Sorry,
credit,
income.
Co-ops.
Should we start with
Co-ops,
co-ops or
yeah.
universal income?
Well, go ahead and go with democratic co-op since we touched it more first.
Okay,
Finish the conversation.
So, oh man, I don't even know where to start. There's so much. Okay, so the basic premise is the idea that you're looking for a solution to an alternative to the hierarchical, concentrated power aspect of capitalism.
Right.
So what is an alternative economic system that can work that way? So we're talking about the theory as opposed to the implementation, okay? So in terms of the theory of democratic cooperatives, there's a lot of research on
Let me
democratic.
stop you one
go ahead.
second.
Yeah.
You're using the term democratic cooperative. Cooperative, I think is what I'm thinking of is just a generic version of cooperative. It has a lot of different, like worker cooperative.
Okay, so there's
what I'm thinking.
there's
like, do you
two
have a specific definition that's different than cooperative?
Yes, and this is part of the economic research on this subject too. Is that there's a distinction between cooperatives. So a lot of cooperatives are just collectively owned by the workers, so they all have part of the shares. So for example, I don't necessarily want to say which one on the podcast, but I'm employed at a employee-owned business.
Yeah.
But I have no say in anything that's done. So there's a difference between worker-owned and worker-directed. A worker-directed cooperative or a democratic cooperative is one where the workers have say in how the business acts.
I need you to delineate that a little more, because if the workers already own the business,
Right.
how are they not running it?
Right. Okay. So so for example, the business I'm part of, all workers own shares in the business, but the number of shares you have changes based off how long you've worked there and the position you hold. So the higher you ascend the hierarchy, the higher the percentage of shares you have. There's still a very clear management hierarchy. You have no say in decision making. Theoretically,
So you're saying it's got a meritocracy in it, that where you actually have to prove you're competent.
yeah,
before
based
you can
off
get equal
whatever criteria is already in place.
which
Yeah,
is the success of the company. So yeah.
sure. Okay. So yeah, it's a hierarchical system. An average employee has no say over anything that's done. They're just an employee like any other random business. The only difference is that they're going to get some stock options.
They don't have any. It's not that they don't have any, because if even if you go on 1% and there's a vote and it's 49 to 40 or 50-50 basically,
Yeah,
you have
so
1%. You could be the
you
deciding
could
It's just
you
that
know
you have less
get
of a percentage of
yeah.
the vote than the people.
in
that vote.
practice, it comes out to where the average employee never impacts the decisions that are made.
Right.
Just because
Which I
some
would say
people...
is a good thing, because the average employee doesn't know how the hell to run a business.
See, and this is where you and I are going to disagree.
And I say all evidence, though, is on my side of that, like, the average person doesn't know how to run a business.
Well, we'll get into that.
You're in a utopian state.
I very much agree that in the way society is currently constructed, that's the case, because
Well, how would you reconstruct society in order for everyone
yeah.
to be able to
So
do that?
okay. For
Let him
example,
finish.
I mean, the way our education system is structured right now is primarily oriented around creating workers that are going to function well within a capitalist economy, which generally means you're going to be good at following directions. You know, that's why our education system is very much around like following directions, taking tests, all these different things. If you have an education system within a economy that's based on democratic participation in the workplace, it's going to be very different. It's going to be based around the kinds of skills you need to operate in a democratic environment. And that also would present the possibility of a reciprocal relationship with the needs you have as a democratic citizen in the political system, which I think is another huge point, because we don't empower people in this society to be effective democratic citizens in the political system because they're being trained how to be good capitalist workers. So if you have a democratic economy, those can be reciprocal. You're empowering people, both within the fact that they have a democratic community in their workplace, which can serve as a foundation for democratic activism in the society as a whole, but you're also training them with all the things they need to be effective democratic citizens.
So let me just jump in for 1 second and say that then would you agree with Chris that it's probably not practical right now to implement a democratic co-op system where everyone has equal voting?
Right. I do agree with that. I think it's
Okay.
something that has to be kind of phased in over a long period of time and come with a lot of institutional supports, and it'll become increasingly democratic over time.
And
That's kind of my idea of it. It would never be just, oh, it's all democratic now.
That's why I don't like, you mentioned earlier, like the subsidy thing that Corbyn's doing and stuff. Like, I don't like things that try to push it from working before it can work. Like, you see what I mean? I don't want
I
them
see
to
what you
like
mean.
try to start doing like, let's dump all this money into this
Yeah.
thing that we think sounds cool and have
Yeah.
no evidence it's going to work right now.
Well, part of their idea is that it would come with a lot of support in terms of like people, you know, coming from cooperatives that are already up and running to come and like help you. Like, here's the model we use. Get on your feet, you know, to where you're like just a functioning business, and then you can start tinkering with shit. That kind of idea. So there would be kind of like that phasing in.
And there's also, his idea or his, idealistic idea of wanting 50% of the businesses run that way, even if it's less than 50% or
Just a
some other-
sector,
Right.
something that gives it
That's-
a competitive foothold.
That also brings some sort of counter argument to your idea that lots of businesses can't be run that way. And of course, you're right in that most businesses would have a huge problem with that, especially right now. But for
There's tons
you know.
of co-ops, just to be clear. Like,
Yeah.
there's co-ops.
That's very different
no
from
matter how-
worker directed, which is what I'm talking
It's
about
not
specifically.
very different. You think it's very different because it's your ideology.
No.
It's very
The
similar.
statistics. The
If you
statistics.
compare capitalism in general, like if you get the broad spectrum of everything you can do economically.
Right.
You're in a very nuanced position between two close things. Cooperatives in general are very related things. I like your version better than the version you're arguing against in a way. But you're still talking about cooperatives, which are still different than
I would argue
majority of other systems.
right, but I would argue that the really key central feature that is the thing that makes it so radically different is the worker-directed part. And so this bears out in a lot of the statistics. So there was, I can bring up the thing. So there was this study done by a French researcher, Virginie Perrotin. Okay, so she's a leading expert on the economics of employee ownership and worker cooperatives. She's been researching the topic for the better part of 20 years and has an extensive list of publications in English and French examining the performance of worker cooperatives.
What was her name again?
Here, I'll spell it for you. Virginie, and then the last name is Perotin. She's a professor of economics at Leeds University Business School since 2001. Before joining the University of Leeds, she was a senior research economist at the International Labour Office of Geneva, Switzerland. She's also held research positions at the London School of Economics and something in French I can't read. A research center of the French Prime Minister's office in Paris. She has acted as consultant to the World Bank and the OECD and the European Commission on issues of profit-sharing, employee ownership, and employee involvement schemes. She's a member of the Council of International Association of Economics and Participation and of the editorial board of the Journal of Entrepreneurial and Organizational Diversity. Okay, so anyway, so she did a huge exhaustive study where she analyzed all the different research that's been done on worker-directed enterprises. So actually where the workers have control over what's done. And there's actually thousands of them all over the world, but they're usually smaller.
Right.
There's a few big examples, like Mondragon is the prominent example.
That can do it, right?
I don't know about that. I mean, there's a lot of lower working, there's a lot of people who are just working regular jobs there. A lot of it's manufacturing. They have, grocery stores. They have all these different things.
At the very least, it would be good to get the IQs of all of those people so that this could be, said whether or not it is so true.
I didn't see any statistics on anything like that, but I know it's just a lot of just regular workers. And so a lot of the different policies they have in place, just to give an example of what they've voted into legislation within their business. So first of all, one of the biggest problems with cooperatives is funding, because banks, they're not familiar with this.
They want a return on the investment.
They want a return on the investment.
They're much more familiar with this than you think, because they're economists that have spent their whole life studying this, and they know that this is very risky. That's why they don't fund it. Not because they just don't like the ideology or have never heard of it.
But it's also something where it's very difficult to get funding for this kind of thing.
Yeah, that's what I'm saying. I mean, it's a risky business.
So anyway, they've created their own internal bank. So Mondragon Corporation actually has its own bank where part of their collective resources go into that bank so they can fund their own things. So they have their own bank, they have their own labs, which do such good research that GM and I think Microsoft and GM send researchers to their labs. They have a rule where you can't do any one repetitive task for more than 2 hours. At 2 hours, you switch with someone else. So everyone learns different tasks within it, so no one's doing the same repetitive shit over and over. To deal with income inequality, they have a rule where the top paid person in the company cannot make more than 8 times what the lowest person is paid. So you're going to cap out at 8 times entry-level wages. And so in order for the top person to make any more, you're going to have to raise wages as a whole.
I'm familiar with the system. It's
Okay.
not just part of coppers.
They have their own university, and their majors include engineering, humanities, business studies, and gastronomic science. And any the kids of people who work there can go to the university for free. Most of the employees are second or third generation now. So a lot of this is their kids are going into it because it was such a good job for their parents, stuff like that. And it's the 7th largest corporation in Spain, and it was founded in 1956. That's true. That's true. I get you.
Being a little derisive here.
Yeah, a little bit. This is just.
I don't like systems like this.
I understand. That's
I get
fine.
you.
But try to be a little more respectful.
I guess the reason I get frustrated is because I know a lot of the economics, and a lot of people have opinions because they learned one specific piece of economics and they thought it sounded cool, but they don't have the broad picture of and especially when you say things like or imply that economists and people in positions that have studied this for years, not me, but like the people at the banks making decisions, that they just don't know that this worked. Like, these people have spent a lot more time than you studying these things.
I understand, but also this is one of the things talked about in this this study was that this is one of the least researched forms of economic model currently that exists. I mean, there was a lot of research done on it after the fall of the Soviet Union because there was a lot of cooperatives that popped up after that. But I mean, it's something that's gotten very little attention in terms of actual like statistical study.
I mean, that's kind of a weird statement that, like, there's an infinite number of economical models. So to say that one is less prevalent than the other, I could find you a model that nobody's ever heard of here before. I mean, I agree it's not.
I'm just saying it's not very well known.
A lot of things aren't well researched. I 100% agree we should research it.
Totally.
Don't get me wrong there. We should research a lot more economics.
Anyway, I'm saying I wouldn't be surprised if people at banks who decide whether to put out loans are not very familiar with this.
They have. Okay,
Right.
that's my point. I agree we need more research. My whole real point here is we need more research before we say, let's just implement this in society because it sounds cool.
Absolutely. Absolutely. The only point I was trying to make earlier was that it's hard for these to get funding. Okay,
Right.
so there's
Which would mean
one
that
example
there'd be
is
less
like there's so in Italy they have a rule where when you get unemployment, so they have a big policy to benefit worker cooperatives. So they have a rule where if you have unemployment, you can choose either to get that doled out over a period of time, like unemployment usually is, or you can choose to get it all up front as a lump sum on the condition that you've got 9 other unemployed people to agree to do the same thing, on the condition that you're going to create a democratic worker cooperative together. So that's another way they've done to try and encourage that. So there's all these different kinds of policies. So anyway, the research about democratic cooperatives, it had a lot of really interesting statistics on the ones that exist. So, for example, let's see. So worker-managed firms show that they have either equivalent or an increase in productivity to traditional capitalist firms. And they were able to show that the worker ownership is not the decisive factor here. It's actually the worker management. And I could go into the language actually used in the study, but it's just essentially stuff that, like, you know, people having a stake in the decision making and actually having some say gives them more buy-in and all that different stuff. Let's see. Annual investment always is at least as large or higher than in traditional capitalist institutions. They're not just like taking it off the top. They're investing it back in the company at least the same or higher levels. There's 2 main critiques among economists that they worry about with democratic cooperatives. One is and so these are both addressing why are they not more prevalent, if they're more productive, these kinds of things. One of them is underinvestment or self-extinction, which is the idea that members are going to sell off their collectively owned shares for short-term profit. So the solutions that some of them have put in place to stop that from happening that can deal with that problem is to make only that part of the capital is owned individually with limits on returns, and the rest is owned collectively and something they can't take from. So it's seen as if the business itself is kind of a public good. You know what I mean? So it's like you can't cannibalize it. It's something that's going to be there. You get small amounts that you can take out of it individually, but no one can just sell off the whole thing itself. And then the other thing is degeneration into capitalist firm. So there have been some examples where what they're going to do is have an increasing percentage of their employees are non-members. So they're hiring people who don't have the democratic rights within the institution. There's the group that does, and then they're hiring temporary employees that don't. And so another concern is, over time, they're going to hire more and more people as non-members until eventually you have a small group at the top who controls it, and it's essentially a capitalist institution again. So ideas that, again, some have put into place to stop this is things like limiting how many non-members you can have, or creating something where, you know, you can have non-members, but after 6 months of employment, they receive membership. And something where, like, you know, for the first 6 months, they're paying part of their income into it as like a due. So almost like a combining of union and business into one entity. Does that make sense?
Yeah.
That kind of idea.
I mean, that's generally the idea of co-ops.
Yeah, yeah. So, yeah, I mean, the statistics are showing that there's no productivity problem. There's no long-term investment problem. The real problem is them getting a foothold within a capitalist environment. And so I
I think
think
you make a jump there because that's not necessarily a problem. It could be that the way that they're doing now is good, and they just need to grow slowly from their current base and prove that the model works.
maybe so. Maybe
It's
so.
not that we need to say that they're oppressed somehow, and we've got to do all this stuff to help grow this model that we don't. We have evidence that in its current state, it works fine. We have no evidence that if we try to blow it up, that it's going to keep those same statistics.
That's
Sorry,
Was that-
I was
no, go
just
ahead,
going to say that is kind of the thing though with crony capitalism, that it does inherently
I'm not
resist
defending
that
crony
types of
capitalism. Just because I'm saying one system is wrong doesn't mean I'm advocating that our current system
Right.
is
No,
wrong.
I understand. I'm just saying that in this system that we currently have, it's difficult to implement different systems because that's kind of a core principle of crony capitalism, is that they sort of muscle out other styles.
And so the
And so
argument in the realm of crony capitalism is that you have to provide supports and subsidies to get it on its own feet,
Yeah.
and then allow it to compete. And you know, if it fails, it fails. But there's no way for it to get that
Capitalism
foothold
happens
in
more
that
at
kind
the
of.
large scale, and I'd rather see it work more on the small scale. See what I'm saying? Like crony capitalism.
Well,
affects
at what
major
level of the
industries,
small
like
scale is
small
it big
businesses.
enough to validate you wanting to give it a
I just
foothold
want
in
to
the
see
big?
more than like a grocery store in my local city. Like
I mean,
want-
there's
I want
hundreds of
some-
thousands of them across the world.
I know. I just
At what level would it then be okay to move it up to the next level to you?
again, to me, it's just.
Or is this just
more
kind of like a general skepticism?
One of the ideas
I
that
need
we-
evidence. Like you have all these like I really think it would work.
Well, he was also citing some studies that have been done about it.
Right, but they're not. It's that idea though that you're taking like okay the thing earlier with the waters rising right,
Right.
from North Carolina. We can't just look at the historical data of water rising to predict what the hell's going to happen because there's too many other factors involved. It's a way bigger scale than just look at this little data point that it happened to do this at. Right, so that's what I'm saying. I'm not saying I hate every part of libertarian. Like I lean towards left libertarian ideas myself. Okay, I'm not like I don't know. Like I said, I have a strange. I don't follow any. I think it's wrong to align yourself with an ideology personally because it puts you into a dogmatic thinking.
See, that's the thing is
I
like
think
I
it's
didn't really
good to
get these
appreciate
ideas
different-
from a particular ideology. Like Chomsky talks a little about this, and I agree with him on a
He
lot of his
basically
political
is
points.
the major figure of this ideology.
Well, yeah, but that's the thing is I didn't even get this idea from Chomsky. I mean, he actually talks about it very little. He talks about it some, just kind of the general idea of workers controlling their own workplace.
Right.
But I mean, this ideology, this idea of democratic cooperatives, I got mainly from a combination of like thinking about how do you institute a real institutional form of democratic activity within the society, thinking of like Cicero, that thing. And then the economist, my favorite economist, Richard Wolff, talks a lot about this, the idea of democratic cooperatives, and it's part of this group called Democracy at Work that's all about kind of like shedding light on any research on this and advocating for it as, you know, we should create a democratic sector in the economy to see if it works better or not, that kind of thing.
One of the issues too I have with a lot of economic models is that they're very based on the past and particularly 20th century ideas of the economy. None of these things have any idea how to account for AI.
That was actually
That's
something
very true.
I was going to bring up.
And so, like, what I want to say again, just to be very clear, because like there may be other ideologies I've criticized. I don't want you to think that just because I'm criticizing
No, I get
libertarian
you.
socialism
I
that
get
I
you.
hate it. I do think though that we need to examine every ideology
Yeah.
with the most critical lens, and in particular, not try to implement things without the best evidence we can get. Because again, in particular with economic systems, we've seen all over the world when people try to make radical changes without strong evidence.
Yeah.
And that's why, you know, we don't need to just have this at the like people like Chomsky who aren't economists talking about this. I want to see it mainstream economists start, and there are some economists.
I mean,
who-
Richard Wolff has a PhD
I
in
know there's PhD
economics and
economists.
history from Harvard, Stanford, and Yale.
I'm not saying
So-
that there's not good people that are doing stuff like this, though. I'm saying, though, the mainstream, the whole...
But the
economic
mainstream
view-
itself is based in a bubble. I mean, you've absolutely
Right.
cleansed the education in
Right, but
economics
you
of
can't
any
just pick
doubt
the
of
fringe
capitalism.
idea that you think is the best. Like, I mean, people make the same argument for communism or anarcho-communism and anarcho-capitalism and
Right.
every other utopian system that you can put on paper and say, look at all these facts. This is clearly going to work. And if you say that it didn't work here, it's because they just didn't do it quite right, and you didn't think of this one thing that's like the essential feature of it. And once you do it this way, it's fine.
See, but this isn't even a utopian. It's still a market. It's still businesses, just like we have now.
That
It's
doesn't
simply
mean
a difference
utopian doesn't have anything to do
in
with
the
markets. Austrian economics is a purely free market system that is utopian. That is not to say that communism is associated.
But this isn't even something that's like a radically outside the box thing compared to what we have now. You're just literally changing the power structure within the business.
That
To
is
say
a
rather,
change.
it's
That's
a
what I'm
radical
wanting
change in
to
terms
you
of
even
that
said
power.
the term earlier that you thought we needed radical.
No. I mean, it's not like you're completely throwing out the system we have and having a totally new one. You're changing the power relation within the institutions that already exist.
Right, but
So it's
that
not
is-
like
that's
going
what
from
bigger
capitalism to communism.
That
Yeah.
is though. That's literally what communism is the change of power systems. You take the power.
But
from
you're,
the bourgeoisie
it's not
and
from
push it
within the
to productivity.
institution. You're taking government, which is its own separate institution,
Well,
and giving it
communists would-
power over
Communists
things.
would argue that the correct version of communism does not use.
I know, but I'm talking about communism as it actually manifested in the real world.
Right. Which is what I'm saying is the difference between your ideology too, is that communism has this cool version that you can say is going to work, and then when you put it in the world, it doesn't work. And that's what I'm afraid is going to happen if we try to large-scale implement libertarian socialism, is that when we actually put it into practice, there's pieces, just like communism, that the communists didn't think of, that is going to cause disruption, that could cause things like the collapse of Venezuela. Maybe not to the same degree, because obviously Venezuela didn't even go communist. They had a
Right.
too rapid, but still a stepwise transition to socialism. It's not even like they rapidly changed. They tried
No,
something
they sell a
roughly
lot
like
of
what you're advocating.
capitalist businesses and stuff, but
Well, yes, but they also are collapsing because they have
They
state
are.
control of everything.
well, a
all the
huge
major
part of that
industries.
was that their whole economy was based off oil, and then oil
Right,
prices
and, well,
tanked.
and they seized the oil.
Yeah,
and then
they
the oil prices.
they nationalized,
And then they started
tanked.
nationalizing more industries as a way to compensate.
But I'm not arguing for any form of nationalization of any kind.
I know that. My point is
It's
not
totally
that.
different.
My point is that just because you think that this thing works on paper really well, billions of people through history have thought that. Much more brilliant
Right.
people
But
than
you
in
can-
this
you
room
can-
have thought of
You
it.
can
Karl
make that
Marx was a
argument
genius.
in general about any alternative system.
Yes, I am making that argument.
Right.
Any alternative system. That's why I'm saying we have to have data, research, and evidence before we move
Yeah, but you
forward. We
can't
need
do
to-
that until you give it some kind of realistic foothold in the economy.
to a degree, but I would say there is some.
And that's all I'm arguing for.
Okay, but like that's fine. I'm not saying that, but I'm just saying be careful as to like not have a system where every time a business sells, everybody can turn it into a co-op. Like
Why
that's-
not?
Because that's too extreme. That means that like the people
Where would be a good level in your point of view to give this a foothold
something
in
more
the
like on the
economy?
universal income, where we say, okay, well, let's have one little state fund a project in like one city where we like do one business or something like. You don't have to do a massive scale.
Are you talking about a big business? Because
Because
there's lots of little businesses already like this,
I'm just
and
saying
we show that
start
they
at
do
a
work.
smaller scale with the experiment. Don't start with like a country in the European Union.
Well-
the whole country.
Well,
implements
it's not
this
in the
one
European
day.
Union.
Or which country was it again?
Britain.
Has Brexit even gone through all the way yet?
It's still in the works.
Yeah, I think technically they are still. But either way, your point's valid.
Well, the other thing that is a problem with that, though, is that one of your criticisms of this is that it doesn't scale well. And so if you try
But
little
you can't
experiments...
just try to scale it and hope it works.
Well, I understand that, but it's also like, how do you
You need
study...
stepwise.
How do you study how well it scales if you're not willing to let it scale at all? You know, you're trying to advocate for a small
Okay,
implementation
do you know? So
of
let's
it.
talk about how empirical data is collected in studies, right? We
Yeah.
have to have it controlled, so we can say, okay, let's try different companies, have a control company. These two companies are competing in the same industry.
Right.
Let's see what happens when we do this model versus this model. We need control data, not just we changed everything. Let's see if it collapsed or not.
Mhm.
Okay, so that's what I'm advocating for is a really scientific approach about this.
I think there's a really logical way to go about it, and I appreciate that. And I would very much advocate for at whatever level is seen as slow enough for us to create a sector where these exist in the economy, to give them enough of a foothold where they're at a competitive level in an economy that we've all acknowledged is fairly rigged already. So that's a difficult question. At what level, are they in a strong enough position where they can compete in the economy that actually exists? And that's why I'm more in favor of this kind of scaling up. I know it's ambitious and risky, but I mean, it's not like you're giving authoritarian institutions control over businesses. Worst case scenario is
But
these
it's
businesses
possible that
fail.
this-
And if the business was already going to go to
The thing
China,
is-
it's
but
not
you're
like it's
assuming it's going to work like it is on paper. It's possible that like the
I'm just saying I wanna
criticisms you
try.
mentioned- I'm saying I want to try too.
Yeah.
I want to try slowly and carefully,
Right.
not let's just run forward and hope it works.
This
Because
would
the
be a
criticism
philosophical
on paper-
difference, because I do see, just in terms of whether it's, what's AI going to look like in the hands of, an economic system and the power distribution that currently exists,
Right.
or with climate change coming up, I I do tend to be more in favor of more radical solutions given the existential threats coming towards us.
Right. But
So-
you have to be careful not to create
That's
a
true.
further existential threat.
That's true. But I think I think really, if you're talking about giving workers control of their own businesses, the worst thing that can really happen is the business fails. You're not going to have...
pretty bad, though, if it
that's
happens on
bad.
a large scale.
Don't
That's
get
what
me
leads to
wrong.
the Great Depression and stuff.
Don't get me wrong. That's bad. And so you want to talk about, what sectors of the economy is this safe to try in?
That's a good one, too. Yeah,
And
exactly.
what size of businesses?
Exactly.
But this is very different. It's a totally different animal than saying, let's give governments control of businesses. Because
Well,
now
I
you're
agree.
risking tyranny.
Yeah, I agree completely. We're on the same page.
Yeah. So I'm less stressed about more rapidly scaling this up because I think it has less risks involved than something like government control. That scares the shit out of me.
Yeah.
I don't want anything to do with that.
Okay, yeah, we're on the same
Okay.
page there. 100%.
Okay. Yeah.
So, I think just to clarify some of those things, like the biggest debate I see between the two of you here is that you like a speed and size of implementation.
Right.
And so,
Which, when you really get down to it, is a pretty good place to be at.
for sure,
Yeah.
and I think that you have a valid point about there needing to be some study at least, or like a lot of thought put into what size and speed and location
And what types of businesses.
are
Right.
actually valid, because like you say, it's hard to control for all these variables
Yeah.
in a system that we have right now. And so like it's very important that we're thinking about that, and we don't want to scale it up to the point where like an extreme failure could cause cascading problems in the economy, which I'm assuming is one of the biggest things you're worried about. But obviously you can't say, like, you can't run an experiment where you're not controlling for those variables either, and then assume that it's representative of how it could function. If you put them as a small business, for instance, like say some business that wants to compete with YouTube comes up and they're like, well, let's try a democratic co-op there. And it's like, okay, well, if they're 100,000 people even trying to compete with YouTube, like as a startup, they're gonna fail. It doesn't matter who runs it, right? And so
I'd be
YouTube's
supportive.
like
I would
almost a
support-
monopoly. So
Exactly.
that's-
And I would support if the government or something wanted to attempt like a single experiment like that and say we're going to give a subsidy to this company to try that. I'd be totally on board with a one-off or like
Right.
a very well thought out
Yeah.
series of experiments in
Yes.
particular. That's what I want to see, and not just a blanket policy that's
And,
like let's
you know,
push this down your throat.
I think that's an interesting question, or an interesting thing to talk about in general. Is we should be doing that kind of thing with multiple systems. We should
Yeah,
be trying
definitely,
different things
definitely.
and seeing can these things work. And one thing that's interesting about economic research today is that we can do that type of thing in microeconomies that are created in video games.
Totally.
So, like EVE Online has a ton of professional economists studying it and also managing it, which I think is really crazy and awesome. And
It's really
interesting.
cool.
And
Yeah.
so I think funding research that works like that, and then trying to take what we learned from those things and implement them in the real economy in the ways that you're talking about, I think is a really great idea.
Yeah.
Yeah, there's tons of game economies that are like that. That like people legit like you can, if you're in business school, you could write a paper on a game economy.
That's so
That's
cool.
a legit thing. Because they're massive.
I
You
feel
look
like-
at, games like WoW and stuff.
Oh,
too,
yeah.
just like
I feel like the kinds of like AI simulation things we're going to be able to run when AI gets better to test things that don't have to exist in the real world is going to get like so much more sophisticated. It's going to be a trip.
oh for sure, yeah.
But just some other kind of like ancillary benefits in terms of like the theory. So I mean, there's certainly issues in terms of where and how fast to implement.
Right.
Totally. In terms of like the broader benefits in the hypothetical case that this succeeds. So I mean, there's that political problem, which is that you're more capable of having a democratic political system if you have a reciprocal relationship with the economic system. If you have a democratic economy, people not only have a democratic foundation of community members where they're interacting democratically amongst themselves on which to ground their democratic activism, they're getting all the training, the education, and how to organize in that way, how to think in that way, and interact in that way. And then on top of that, you have a lot of the big problems of capitalism that this could potentially deal with. So the inequality, things like passing that initiative. Almost all democratic cooperatives pass something like that thing Mondragon has, where they make that income gap.
Right. That's really
Cap.
important. That's
Um,
probably the coolest part to me.
Exactly. And then things like, environmental degradation. People are far less likely to choose within their business to destroy the environment or pollute the environment around them if they're the people that live in this environment. You've got all these chemical companies in Louisiana and stuff that just destroy the bayous and like all these places and the workers feel shitty about it, but they need the work.
Right.
You know? And you're not going to have a business that sells off and moves to China. If the workers have to vote, do you think we should lose our jobs and move the business to China? They're going to vote no. So, I mean, some of our biggest problems right now, inequality, deindustrialization, and climate change, this has huge positive implications to deal with a lot of the problems we face, and the lack of political sovereignty.
Yeah.
So, I mean, there's a lot of big potentialities.
I'm curious as to like your take on the education system in relation to that. Like,
So
how
this is
would you think
actually-
that would what would you do to the education system?
Okay.
to foster those
So this is
democratic-
actually...
Before we go to that, I wanted to see, did you have anything that you wanted to add to
Yeah,
the
get in there,
conversation
Drewby.
about the Democratic co-ops?
I'm stoked to talk about that, though, because actually thinking about democratic education, I thought of before I got into economics, because I started off from an interest in Athens and Rome and education in terms of my history interest. So that's actually what led me down this, is how do we get an education system
Okay.
that is democratic in nature? But anyway, go ahead, Drew.
Yeah, I mean, I do. Once Stan did bring up the idea of like you have to be able to teach people for like the economic system that we would be working in, and since it is like democratic, the co-ops would be democratic. It does seem like really cool that like to imagine people who like they go to work and think this way, and then they go out and then they're chatting with their friends, and then they talk about like politics, and they know every single little like trick that you have to pull. Like, are you thinking about this? Are you thinking about this? Kind of like. It also improves like scientific thinking, I think, like rational and like critical thinking, just because that I feel like is necessary in democracy if you really want your business to continue.
It should be necessary.
Yeah.
Right.
Yeah.
Well, if you want your
it's like an actual necessary.
well, if you want your business to continue, I feel like it has.
I think it's
Right,
necessary for a democracy to actually flourish. I think
Right.
that's
That's
Yes.
Exactly.
Yes, it's kind of like an institutional prerequisite to a good functioning one.
Yeah.
yes.
I mean, that's part of the problem, is we have an education system meant to facilitate an authoritarian economic system, which kind of cripples our capacity as democratic citizens in a political system, you know? So my idea of an education system, and I'm by no means an expert on how this would go. I mean, we'd need research on, you know, what education systems work best to facilitate all this. But I mean, I would draw a lot of inspiration from the thoughts in ancient Athens, talking about how you don't educate people based off just giving them knowledge and memorization of facts. You give them the capacities to learn for themselves, to question things. Things like, you know, teaching them big topics like logic, ethics, rhetoric, you know, physics. The kind of like the core things that make you a functioning, you know, liberated individual. And I think that is very in line with American values as well.
Right.
You know, and kind of the aspirations of America and what that kind of individual liberty is supposed to be.
Yeah.
The whole Western tradition. And so I think there's a lot of potential there to really liberate the individual and the human experience, as well as create a better world for, you know, that we live in. So I think education would be based a lot less on memorization, a lot more on building up the characteristics of the individual, a lot more on debate and collective action, and to question things, and individual sovereignty, and just all of that.
We're 100% on the same page.
Yeah, and that's where I started off, because I was starting off going, why is our education system not making us that way?
Yeah.
And go, oh, well, you know, business interests really affect how our education system works in each era to create the kind of workers they want.
Right.
And so now it becomes an economic problem and a political problem. And that's really how my line of thinking got to democratic cooperatives, was starting off with, why aren't we educated like the Athenians? Why aren't we all these things we claim we're supposed to be? So
One of the
that's
things-
really the roots of where I'm at.
One of the things that also comes to mind when, like, for, like, studies, because now I'm thinking about, like, different kind of researching for, like, Mondragon and other co-ops like that, is I would be really interested to see, how depression and anxiety is, like, compared to the rest of the population in, like, Spain for Mondragon, because I would like to see, obviously you'd have to correlate it with, like, IQ and stuff like that, but, the interesting thing to me is that I feel like a lot of people are like either depressed or anxious about things that they can't do anything about now. There's a lot of like existential that may not even be existential, like to the point of all of humanity, but individually existential.
Dread.
Yeah, exactly. That they feel like they can't do anything to help their country, basically. It's like they don't, or at least they don't know. So what they do is, again, they like simplify, make it so that they're day-to-day, right, rather than long trajectory kind of stuff. And if you did have an outlet where at work you knew that you had that, you knew that, yeah, maybe, okay, I don't get to decide what, like, the big policies are in America. Maybe I don't get to choose if if the army goes to war or whatever. You know, it's like, then at least you get to have that outlet at work. And, like, I would be interested if that declines the kind of anxiety and depression that comes along with it.
This led me to one other kind of question regarding that. Like, I wonder if you've seen any criticism in this area as far as, like, because I did mention sort of like it divulging into a capitalist thing, but I'm thinking, like, it's almost like every company would be like a mini government.
Yeah,
Exactly.
sort of like a small, and that's one of the really interesting
dynamic.
things is we know democracy works best on small scale.
Right, but what I'm wondering is, what if one company got too big with that model and scaled and essentially became a corrupt government?
Yeah, that's interesting.
That's interesting.
I don't really have, I haven't put enough thought into that to have a good answer. I still think overall the economy would be far less corrupt than the one we have now, even if there are examples of that.
Awesome.
Because, I mean, at least there's that accountability to your employees.
Especially if they got another layer of oversight between the actual government.
Right,
that could prevent
exactly.
that from-
And you know what? A tyrannical company is not as dangerous as a tyrannical government. I mean,
Depends
we have
on the
tyrannical
size of
companies
that
already,
company.
too.
You know,
Don't get me wrong, I think those are dangerous.
Check out that Harari talk after this, because he
Okay.
mentions in that, because at the end they asked the dude, I can't remember his name, the TED guy, he like asked him a couple questions. He's like, so, you know, you talk about how companies have the data and stuff, shouldn't we be more worried about governments concentrating our data because they're harder to overthrow? And he was like, no. He was like, whoever has the data is your real government. It
Yeah,
doesn't matter
exactly.
if whatever company has
I
it.
agree completely. Yeah, so
Definitely.
yes.
Also, the idea that companies can literally be in how many different countries at one time?
Yeah.
They get
all
to
of
affect,
them.
they get to affect as many politics as
Right.
they want.
That's
so
Still,
it's
I
not
would
just-
much prefer a business that's at least democratically accountable to its own employees to have my data
I would
than
say,
a company that just has like a board of directors and CEOs.
No, I would say that
There's
it
at
would
least
be
a layer of accountability.
very difficult to get to that level with this, just because of the individual like resilience of every single
We would
person.
hope, at least.
Yeah,
yeah.
Our things like the
hopefully.
Nazi Empire, so there are conditions that
No,
can create
true,
that.
100%.
And that's one of the things I worry about is like the conditions that could put pressures that we don't think
Right.
about. that
And
could
there's gonna be a lot of
really
problems. I
Which
mean,
is
it's just
actually-
like when capitalism emerged out of feudalism.
Yeah,
There was a lot of problems they didn't foresee, and it was
Right.
very
Well,
dirty and messy.
but I also think that was actually cool because you would see that there would be like the pushback against, like if the co-ops came up, there would be pushback from the capitalists, and then that would actually force them to be like, well, this is why we're better, or this
Right.
is why we're worse.
Yeah.
Same with the feudalism.
Well,
kind
and
of thing.
as much as I agree with you in that point you made earlier about like banks not necessarily like trying to keep down the little guy, however, there are specifically with cooperative banks. The big banks has actually pushed through legislation to try and make it much more difficult for cooperative banks to get a foothold. But that's a direct competitor, so that makes more sense.
Be curious, what is the difference between a cooperative bank and a credit union? Is there?
I think
Any difference?
credit union is a type.
Okay, yeah.
I
They're all
do.
pretty prolific. Depends on what part of the country you're in.
Well, I
too,
think
'cause
there's
some
something that
states will cause
stops them from
problems with
getting
that.
to like. I don't know the actual
Most of them
legislation.
actually limit their own growth on purpose because they don't want
Right.
to turn into these giant.
The big
banks.
fucking
so-
for sure.
Right, and it's nice because you actually a lot of times get better interest rates and stuff.
You
for
really, the credit unions are the shit.
Do you see also just
I divested from Bank of America to go to a credit union during the whole Dakota Access Pipeline thing,
Oh, nice.
so that was cool.
just the fact that is a thing that's been shown to happen, that moral imperative taking over like an economic imperative, where they're literally just like, I'm gonna put a cap on my growth. Like, when have you heard that from like a capitalistic, like straight capitalistic company? Just being
So there's a couple other benefits I hadn't mentioned yet. So part of the study showed that they analyzed how these democratic cooperatives responded to the economic crashes. And it was really interesting because what they did was almost across the board, rather than firing people, they all collectively agreed to lower their wages as a whole and to kind of like weather it, making a smaller income until the crisis was over. They put all the emphasis on keeping their jobs, even if it wasn't paying much. And then as soon as the economy got better, they increased the wages again. So
That's
it showed it had more versatility in terms of
Yeah.
weathering stuff like that because they think as a community. It's not
Yeah.
a business that sees its workers as human capital.
Right.
So there's this kind of like core incentive thing where current capitalist businesses, their primary thing, one at the top, is profit. And workers are seen in some ways as very much as one of the main liabilities to profit, even though they generate it, because they're one of the huge costs. So a lot of capitalist institutions are trying to lay off workers to save costs, to automate, to get rid of the workers if they can. Whereas in a democratic cooperative, the jobs are number one. And profit would be a slightly lower incentive, which is a necessary incentive to keep the jobs, but it would never supplant the job as the core motive, which I think is a much healthier model, because it's a system that serves the people in it,
I agree
primarily.
with that. I think one of the big issues with it is that, well, we mentioned earlier, the AI issue. Just thinking
Yeah.
about that, it's like, jobs. We're basing
Yeah.
all this around the idea of jobs, but those are about to all be gone in the next 50 years.
Well, but check this
Yeah.
out. Another weird question that could happen
I
in
thought
a
about
co-op.
this too.
In a co-op would be, do we want to make everything AI?
Well, the issue with that, though, is
They
that
could say
you
no
have
to
to do that in a wholly democratic co-op system then. And because if one company does, then they're
Then
going to
they're gonna
Well,
outcompete you.
unless my idea would be so Mondragon also or easier one to think about is Google. It's like Google has how many things they do for their employees? Like they have multiple different types of food you can get where they're classified differently depending on health and shit like that. They have masseuses, they have restrooms, they have all of these different types of things that if you look at it, you're like, wait a minute, that's just I think every human should probably have that and they would be happy if we all did that kind of organization. And then you get to see that and that's how I kind of view universities should be run the same way as Google, and we kind of got to that point the other night. But it's the idea would be that you have it doesn't matter now all of what's happening on the outside, if there's a bunch of companies that are running by AI, because your system works so well with the people who are with you that it'll work as its own government. It'll be its own economy.
Self-contained.
Unless you literally then get people who are physically fucking with you, and then now you
This
have
this
war,
is an
right?
interesting question. So if you're a part of a democratic cooperative, what do you think you're going to decide to do if the potential to automate most of your work comes about? I think a lot of them would probably decide to have these robots do most of the work and just not have your pay change, and you just get more time off. I think it'd be a lot more leisure time in a world where the AI is in the hands of democratic workplaces.
I feel like it's Dwight's point though, of if everybody did that, that'd be awesome.
But in a world, yeah, for sure.
Yeah.
Obviously now we're trying to get into utopian because this is a lot of variables.
Right.
But my
AI
ideal world would be one where AI is doing all the menial labor in the world, and the only businesses that exist are ones for human service and enrichment, and they're all run democratically by their workers.
Yeah.
If that's purely utopian, but we're
course.
talking on a very theoretical
certainly
level.
Be nice.
Right.
Yeah.
And I think this is a really good segue.
I moved there.
A really good segue into one of the other things that we want to talk about. We got about a half an hour left, so we can really get into this a little bit. Is that the idea of universal basic income and the effect of AI in the future, and what sorts of economic models and government models can work in that type of society. And so I would pose to the group, let's start with what do you guys think about UBI, just in general.
Yeah, I have a few different thoughts on this. I think Elon Musk made a really good point about, so there's the risk of de-incentivizing people to go get a job if you have universal basic income, especially if you'll lose it if you start making X amount of money.
Definitely.
So Musk's idea was never have anyone lose it. No matter how much you get, you still get your basic income. So that's just kind of the floor. And then people are going to decide how much they want to better their lives, and they'll know there's no other variable.
I think
that's a really good idea.
I agree. To call it universal basic income and then have it be lost in some cases is kind of a misnomer, I would say.
I think that's pretty stupid. There's ideas about it replacing essentially the whole rest of the welfare state. I think that's an interesting idea. Makes me a little nervous.
Have you heard Yang's idea for that? So what he wants to do, if he got elected, could implement it, would be to try to replace the welfare state sort of slowly as an opt-in model. So essentially you could keep whatever benefits you have now, or you can just take the $1,000
That's
check.
better.
Yeah.
That's good. I don't like the idea of getting rid of it entirely because it scares me.
Yeah, there's too many people dependent on it to just have a system.
Yeah,
shot
again,
on
that
it.
kind of idea of that quick
you gotta
turnover.
have,
But I definitely think it's a good idea like to try and incentivize people to switch.
Yeah.
So that over the
Right.
course of a decade or more, we're starting to
Yeah.
get to the point where we could eliminate it feasibly without too much shock.
I think universal income is a good idea. I still center my views on democratic cooperatives, even in a world where there is universal income, because from my perspective, one of the central problems in society is the concentration of wealth and power, specifically power. And so another ancillary benefit of this democratic cooperative model is it really is a political attack on the control that wealth has on the political system. The more of the economy that can be inhabited by democratic cooperatives, the less of that wealth will have a monopoly on its ability to buy the government. If democratic cooperatives are buying the government to do things, because the government's just corrupt still, but it's taking money from democratic cooperatives, I think that's much more likely to serve the interests of the people than, these Goliath hierarchical institutions. Obviously, I'd like money to get out of politics entirely, but I think it's an improvement in terms of it serving the people.
People will try to serve their own interests, though. That's like what we have with
It's
the
true.
partisan issue right now.
Yeah.
Like, if
Even businesses,
if a Christian co-op got control, they might decide vote to lobby the government for
or an
fundamental
oil
schools.
co-op might still do shit about climate change.
Try to deny climate change.
Don't get me
We
wrong.
really need more CO2.
I know.
Guys, check this out.
And that's why I'm saying that this is not a utopian idea.
Yeah.
There's real issues that still exist that are connected to the issues we face now. I just think it's a massive improvement. But I really do think that authoritarian hierarchical structure of society is the thing we need to get rid of. Because I think in a post-AI world, you're going to have China, or something like China, which is going to take this full authoritarian. And I think the only way to counterweight that, to create still a sanctuary in the global civilization that is based on individual liberty and freedom and democratic interaction with one another, is going to be if we create that like now, like before that kind of authoritarian arms race starts. Because I think America is starting to go, well, I'm afraid I'm losing my top at the heap of the hill, and so I'm going to start doing that scary authoritarian shit because I'm afraid of losing top dog status. I'm really worried we're going in an authoritarian direction. And I think radical democratization of our institutions may become increasingly necessary to guard against this kind of post-AI dystopia that is at least manifesting in what is going to become the most powerful country on the planet.
Yeah, that is scary for sure. What do you have to say about that, Drew?
Yeah, I mean, I think that's pretty. I think that's true. I don't know, like, the idea that any more democracy in our country would be bad, I don't think is. I think that anyone would disagree with that. Like, if we could find any
There are
places
people
where
who
we
would,
can.
but-
Okay, yeah. Well, against authoritarianism. How about that? Like, any more democracy.
Everyone would agree except the authoritarians.
Right.
Yeah, right. So.
In which case, if your argument is, I want to be one of the oligarchs, I say, go fuck yourself.
Totally. So, I mean, I think it does come down to group dynamics, and at least, like, it would be, like, in democratic co-ops, it would at least infuse the idea of group dynamics, because I feel like that's another really big, like, psychological issue that we have nowadays is, like, a lot of people feel like an individual who's trying to get as much as they can from the system that's trying to fuck them.
Certainly in America. For
Yeah,
sure.
exactly. And I guess that's what I'm
Mm-hmm.
mostly talking about. So the idea that there is also this place where you have to do, there's like not profit isn't the number one thing, the number at the end isn't the number one thing. You can still have that human interaction and that like, that compassion that can come just from, maybe you're not like an Einstein, but people will still keep you around because you make them laugh every once in a while, and maybe that actually does help you work more. Maybe that doesn't have a dollar value in the profit, but maybe it just makes you feel better as a person, and you don't have to do as much healthcare or stuff like that. I feel like there's a lot of psychological values that are not incorporated into our economic system, and I feel like this could probably help. with
Hopefully,
that.
yeah. I think it'd be an improvement for sure.
And
but
I think one of the
still a
biggest
lot of
things in authoritarian governments seem to me as they try to objectify every psychological thing. You know, so it's like the basic premise would is that everyone's an object in an authoritarian.
yeah, I
government.
mean it's called human capital in economics.
Right.
You know that's dehumanizing in and of itself.
So
Totally.
yeah.
Oh, what was I gonna say? Anyway, I'll think of it again.
I was also wondering what you had to say about UBI.
Oh, the universal. Well, yeah. For me, that I think it seems obvious, even if you're just looking at the like structure of what it takes to be a human being, like on this planet. I think it's really important that for some reason, like that, we take into consideration that if we have the values that people like deserve to be living on this planet, like if they're alive, they were brought into this world and like they deserve to at least be living, then I feel like that's necessary there needs to be at least like some resources given to those people, if not an income for them to acquire those resources. And so I think that for us to really be like, unless someone obviously commits a crime that makes it way more let's like you could get into whether you think about capital punishment and stuff like that, like at least you can talk about a criminal, but like to say that there's a person that comes into this world who doesn't have enough resources to live or to live like a life that we know would probably make them into a better person, that we haven't like just admitted that and somehow incorporated that into our system in a very like substantial way. I think that's irresponsible, and I think that's just
agree.
like
It brings up the thing that Jordan Peterson talks about when he talks about IQ, is that the Army, it's illegal to induct anyone into the Army that has an IQ of less than 83, which is about 10% of the population. And so he equates that to basically saying if the Army can't find a job for you, then there's probably no job in society for you. Or there's at least very few, which means that 10% of the population basically cannot be used for anything as far as the economy is concerned.
Exactly.
And
So then it's a matter of our morals. Does that mean we take care
Exactly.
of the vulnerable, or does
Exactly.
that mean we
Right.
sacrifice them?
And the interesting thing that AI brings to the table when we're talking about this is that IQ of 83 is only going to grow.
Yeah.
Like, it's only going to go up and up and up until, the IQ of 145 is barely enough to get you a job, and that's genius level right now. So it's like,
Well, I wonder if that's going to be relative, because
let's hope that our
maybe
intelligence
not.
increases.
Because
too.
maybe it's like, your intelligence needs to be so high in relation to the other people you're interacting with, so that scale is just going to keep going up.
Yeah,
Like maybe a 145 IQ is going to be just a worthless soldier in a world where the average soldier is a 250, So,
knows?
who knows?
Yeah.
But the other thing I was going to say is, aside from universal basic income, because I think there's nothing to stop universal basic income from existing in dystopian China. So I don't think it addresses the problem of authoritarianism that is on the rise, which is why I'm still focused on democratic cooperatives, because I'm trying to answer that question. How do we keep a free society? But another thing, just like as an idea of a business that might be good to transition to the democratic model, think of news, think of journalism, think of the media. Imagine a publicly funded but internally democratically run media. I mean, it's just fascinating to think about the possibilities there, especially within a culture where you have that strong democratic citizenry with that education.
But
You know what I mean?
If the public was funding it, wouldn't you be behooving to the government and their ideals? Because they're not going to allow you to essentially do anything you want.
See, that's an interesting question, because, how do you fund something so that it can do its work without thinking about profit, without having it beholden to the source of that income?
I really like the Patreon model for stuff like that.
Crowdsourcing?
Crowdsourcing
Absolutely.
is great. Have you heard of Patreon?
Yeah, no, I subscribe to a couple things. Like Democracy at Work. I pay them
nice.
$5 a month.
Yeah, I really like that model for that. I don't think it scales.
Well, what about I don't know. I think that's a good model if there's enough support there. But I like the idea of it being something that's like an embedded right, as opposed to something that's only available if we can crowdsource it.
Mm-hmm.
So I mean, what about something that's like, because we have a constitutional right to a free press.
Right, but the problem is usually when the government is involved, that's what's the definition of it not being a free press.
That's true. Although I would say, publicly funded media like, PBS, I think is better than corporate media. So
Largely, yeah.
it's not like
They don't really
corporate
cover
media,
news,
it's
though.
free
Like,
media.
The reason PBS is good is because they don't cover news. They
It's just
try to
like
focus on education.
informational education.
Yeah.
It's
Well,
tough. This is a
there's
tough
also-
one, but we need a free democratic media.
Okay.
If there's a so I think one of the biggest problems with that, like having a government funded media like outlet, is the setup. Because if you were to set it up in such a way that like their funding could not be cut or something like that, like it was really hard to manipulate.
Yeah, like constitutional.
Kind of like how judges are set up to try to avoid any influence from government, interests, right? So some way that we can sort of kind of like
Put a
try to
barricade
wall them
going,
off
yeah.
from any sort of government backlash from something they might say.
Yeah.
It does. I like the idea because right now
Yeah,
what we
the funding
have,
would have to be somehow in
Put it in
stone.
mandatory spending.
Yeah.
You couldn't have a discretion.
exactly, because the fact that we have media beholden to profits right now is one of the things that allows it to run away with models of inflammatory news and sensationalistic news, and if you had a company that wasn't worried about making more money, it was just trying, hopefully trying to just present
They just
good
run
news.
on their principles and their, and the
Ideally.
people who get into it
Yeah.
would just be like, I'm making enough money to make a living, but the reason I'm doing this is because I'm a patriotic democratic citizen.
Hopefully that would be what would happen.
Right.
Exactly. And that, the interesting thing is, right, like if you set this up with an idea that you're trying to remove negative incentives, you could also unintentionally remove positive ones too. So like it'd be interesting to see what would actually happen and what the incentives of the people that went there could be, and how you could try to set it up in a way that was somehow trying to be more objective and trying to be more fair to everyone.
Yeah.
But I think that it definitely has some potential and a lot more potential to be less corrupt than what we have now.
It's
One of
just
the other
something to
problems
toy
though
with.
with corruption when you don't have a profit incentive is then it becomes an incentive for corrupt people to seek that out. Because like if I wanted to instill communism or fascism into the population,
Right.
the best thing for me to do is to go work for the government.
And
so I
disseminate
work
it
my
from
way
a
up.
place of safety.
Exactly. Yeah.
That's how I felt like when the first thing that came to mind when we were talking about it was like for like the universities, because you would think that like if we think of Alexandria as like the first like university that pops into my mind, I'm like, okay, well everyone who taught there were just like the head people were philosophers, but now you think about that now and it's like, who are the head people at a university?
Yeah.
So
Essentially business majors.
exactly.
Yeah.
And that's because, and in my head, it's like what supplanted the truth was profit. So as long as the other idea for universal basic income, I think that is like a really cool idea that infuses into like just like people's worldview, is that we should focus on maybe like materialistic resources and like the organization of materialistic resources as something that is kind of like a minimum that just needs to happen, and then the meritocratic kind of ideas can be in a way of like more artistic things, more like creative things. So if we go to the news thing, it's like if you get a certain amount of money, everyone gets a certain amount of, or I guess every news outlet gets like a certain amount of money, then literally what is you worry, okay, well what's the point in writing good news? And it's because people will listen to you more. You might not get paid, but like, do we
Well, and now
really
you're benefiting
all...
society by
Exactly.
informing the populace.
But do you see how that has nothing to do with profit?
No.
There's
I mean, the
also
real
incentive
role...
issue though of whether or not people will watch it. is another
Exactly.
question.
Yeah.
Right.
It is a very
If it's
good
not just
question.
like, catchy entertainment bullshit.
Right.
Yeah.
Hopefully you've engendered the kind of culture at that point.
I feel like you go back to the school system.
Yeah,
where you've
it's
gotta
all
keep
the
it
school
top.
system always has to
Yeah.
come part of this. This is just like I just kind of threw that out there because there's a fun thought exercise to think about where you could apply the democratic model to different businesses that I think would improve them. One, Drew, is imagine publicly funded universities democratically run by their professors. Or if you want to get even more radical, with some participation even by the students.
Mm-hmm.
Like, what would that look like in terms of, that kind of vibrant, organic, educational, institution? I mean, it's fascinating to think about
Totally.
possibilities.
I think that does get into... I think that's actually a really good place of like getting into why it's important to have the meritocracy, though.
I agree, but I also think you should... I don't believe that meritocracy and democracy are not compatible.
Fair.
Because when I look at ancient Athens, they appoint people to positions of power and follow those people's lead. And a lot of times it's the best and brightest. A lot of times it's people who have come out from the citizenry, to show their quality, and they convince the people. This has a dark side too, because demagogues and tyrants are also very good at convincing the people, especially during times of stress or war or crisis. So there's that problem as well. But at least when you contain it to businesses, if they kind of go crazy and collapse, it's contained. At least more than if you did it with a government.
I think it goes actually a really good example of it is a funny one that just came to mind, but in Game of Thrones with Blackfish. Blackfish does his best to he's like, no, I'm not going to let you in. I'm not going to let the Lannisters in. You can take this fucking castle if you want to. And then you have the dude who was like, okay,
Spoiler alert, by the way.
Oh, yeah, sorry. But yeah, you have the nephew that goes in and is like, I'm going to, usurp you. Using the same power, which would be for me in my head would be the democratic power if you have someone.
See, but I would argue though that that's neither democratic nor meritocratic. Blackfish would be meritocratic in that he had the best ideas, he was the best qualified, he was the real soldier, right?
Yeah.
And Edmund?
I think something like that.
Yeah.
He obviously was lesser on the meritocratic scale, but you're within a feudalistic system. Mm-hmm. So the soldiers are just simply acting in response to the hierarchy.
Right.
Oh, he's the Lord. I have to listen to him, even though you have the better idea. Mm-hmm. That's not democracy. That's not a democratic thing. He's going, no, but he's our Lord. That's what the guy says.
It's true.
He's our Lord.
Oh, yeah, that captain did say
so it's an appeal to hierarchy, not to democracy.
Yeah,
it's not like the people got together. Who do you think we should listen to? Let's vote. Let's debate it.
No. Well, I
also that is an interesting idea, though. What if they had gotten together and debated it? Is that really the better idea?
I don't know.
To let the Lannisters in or not? Because I don't remember the exact.
I would have rather seen that than simply.
Right. Certainly.
the only thing that I wanted to point out,
at least it's on them what they suffer.
Was okay, but I also don't think that tension is completely devoid of democracy, because that's also definitely mob rule kind of idea. I get that you're focusing on the fact that there was a hierarchy that was in place, but that's it's still an example of someone who did have power. Everyone was listening to him because he was the Blackfish, and he wasn't the Lord, but he was the Blackfish. And then at least there was some tension that came across with.
So they had to make a decision.
Exactly.
I would argue, though, it would only become democratic at the point where they exert their free will over that situation and discuss it and come up with their own collective consensus, because they didn't question it individually or as a group. They simply kind of had a computational dispute. Oh, who is superior on this hierarchical program that I'm following?
Well, I think that's where the tension came up.
Also, just that one guy, and then he was essentially the real leader because he he had the authority over all of the men.
I get that there is the democracy.
If there was any democracy, it was that much.
But But what I'm saying is, I don't want to get away from the idea that there isn't going to be that power structure within democracy. I think it's very natural for some people to be listened to a lot more than other people.
Definitely.
I agree, but if it's not institutionally embedded, it's going to be a lot less
which is why I was using it as an example, not to be literal, but as a good example of what might occur when it happens.
And I think the more you democratically empower people, the less they're prone to be influenced by that kind of appeal to authority,
I don't necessarily want to say that. I would say that it's much about trying to become better. Whatever that tension is, to progress. That usually keeps people awake. Because if they get into a place of everyone is we're pretty great, it's they're let's try that idea. Let's try that idea. Why not that idea? Because they are so stable that they're I can try anything. Really.
I feel a lot of times it actually works the other way, where when you're really stable,
you don't try anything.
You're not trying anything because you're happy with what's going on.
No, that's
it's
why
when you're unstable in cycles of very...
Well, yeah,
you weren't trying anything. I wasn't saying that the people who were let's try that, they're saying that because they're not coming up with anything. So someone else comes in and says, I have a great idea, guys. This can be wonderful, but you've been stable for so long that you're not critical and you're not critically thinking anymore.
I agree. It could become less innovative.
Oh yeah, that guy. Why not?
I I actually think they'd be more likely to do that in a time of stress or crisis.
Certainly, if we look at history, that's what we see.
Yeah, looking at history, it's democracies or institutions that have democratic aspects to them always are more active in times of stress and least active in times of stability.
I mean, I think that it's stable. I think the one thing is that it's usually losing stability, right? Like that's the stress comes from losing stability.
Yeah.
So that's the place. So yeah,
Systemic, like outside pressures,
So,
environmental pressures.
yeah. So there could be a point at which you reach a certain level of stability where you just don't change anything, right? But that would also probably not be the best. Like, I don't know. Like, a lot of people would argue
stability
that
doesn't
when...
stay the same over time,
Yeah.
right?
Yeah.
Like he's saying, the environment's going to change.
Exactly.
I think the people are.
Depending.
I think that a democratic culture is more likely to make sober decisions during a time that's stable. Maybe someone can still come in and say, "Hey, I have this idea. We should do this new thing." But people are going to be more skeptical if things are good right now.
For sure.
You know what I mean?
I agree.
Whereas if shit's
True.
crazy, people in tandem with said craziness become more open to crazy shit.
True, but we're
It's
also...
like right now, Trump can only happen because there's a huge portion of the population that's in a state of stress or despair of some kind.
I just want to, like, I guess what I'm trying to get across is that when you're stable, it's more difficult. Like, you might have a good idea of what it is that had created that stability, but it's not always apparent. And so it's that same idea that you get when, let's just, and one thing would be, like, Plato's Cave is a great example of this, where they're so, like, stuck in the way that they're thinking that this guy comes in and it's like, hey guys, we promised that, like, I went and checked out, there's, like, all this wonderful shit that you're not paying attention to. Come and get out. And they're like, no, we don't believe you. So that's another, like, so I'm saying, there's...
And I'm saying... They're more likely to say, okay, let's leave the cave if there's like an earthquake happening or something like that. You know what I mean? Like if they're just cool, if they're good and there's meat on the fire and it's warm in the cave.
I'm just saying,
like, fuck off, Socrates.
But that's a clear way. That's a clear way forward. That's a clear way forward, right? I'm just saying that, like, So, I guess the thing was like. We lose our ability if we become stable. First, we become sensitized. That's one big thing that we were talking about, like, the other night. Like, and I think that's kind of like we're showing that now, where it's like we're so worried about how all of these, like, different, like, political ideas will change us that we're, like, trying really hard not to do anything. Sure, you get the extreme people who will vote for Trump and stuff like that, who wanted, like, throw chaos, but that's not because they thought they were stable. They thought they were in a shit place, and a clear way forward would be to elect Trump.
Yeah.
Well,
especially,
I think that mentality or that phenomenon is what kind of precipitates these cycles of stability and then, like, crises.
Yeah.
Where people during times of stability or perceived stability are so resistant to change that they're unwilling to change with the environment. And so they maintain this idea that they have that they think is working until it literally stops working. As opposed to recognizing that it's not working as well as it used to and trying to make incremental changes. They're like, no, it worked for a while. Let's just keep it the way it is. Like, maybe it'll get back to where it was.
Right.
And then something crashes and they're like, fuck. Let's, what about you? Can you do it? And they just, like, grab the nearest crazy dude and they're like, let's put him in charge and see what'll happen.
That guy usually says,
roll them dice.
No, guys, I have the idea. I have the solution.
I was definitely, broad strokes there.
Yeah.
I think in terms of, like, our current political landscape, it's particularly troubling because when you factor in the unresponsiveness of our political institutions because they've been captured by corporate power, people sense this. I mean, people understand the government's bought. And people understand the government's not working for them. And the worse that perception gets, combined with a worsening of people's material reality around them, they're gonna get more and more radical. Because the system's not responding to them in, like, a slow way along with the rise of their stresses. It's not providing piecemeal reform to ease their suffering.
Exactly.
And so the pressure, it's like you have something cooking on a pot and there's no air to get out.
Yeah.
And it's just, and so they're going to throw crazy shit at you eventually. I mean, I think of Trump as, a certain sect of the population faced with that reality that we all share, you know, and they just turned to the Molotov cocktail that was near them, and they're just throwing it at a system that's not responding to them because they don't know what else the fuck to do.
I think
Like,
that's
whatever's happening right now isn't working for me, so...
I really like that analogy for Trump as
Yeah.
a Molotov cocktail. I
Yeah.
feel like that's very fitting given what he's been doing.
No kidding. But if
I-
you're in a situation that you know is on a linear progression towards a lessening of your material circumstances,
Right.
your only option is to try to destroy that system.
Fair
Totally.
enough, yeah.
No, I would agree with
By
that.
the way, we got about 9 minutes left, so...
Okay.
But again, that gets to my idea that there is a clear way. They're not in a good... Okay, let's at
It's
least
also not
say...
democratic because it's not responding to them.
I think one of the underlying problems of the whole thing here too is that humans crave authority, and that's why a lot of even democratic systems tend towards authoritarianism.
Yeah.
Because people like
That
us,
is
we
a
don't
part of
probably
human
crave
nature.
it as much as most people, right? Like there's
Yeah.
free thinkers that don't want authority, but a lot of people can't function
Yeah.
without authority. They legitimately
Yeah.
don't want. Like
Well-
there are people who would hate to. My wife
I know.
would hate to work at a Democratic co-op. If you asked her to vote all the time, she'd just be like, "No,
And
I don't care. I have
that's a
other
really
shit
good
to do."
point. And I think that's made particularly bad because getting back to education and all that, I think we have a society in place meant to encourage that
Yeah.
and to facilitate that because of how much of our interactions are within an authoritarian context.
It's like what we were talking about last night with how authoritarian education is, where like if there's a teacher up there that's saying
Yeah.
a thing and somebody's like, hey, I'm not sure that thing's right, they're like, well, fuck you, I'm the teacher.
Yeah.
I know.
See,
Right,
like,
and even outside, like my wife was mostly educated outside of the education system, so that doesn't even necessarily.
Okay.
was she in a fundamentalist community too?
Yes, actually, we were up homeschool
Yeah.
originally, but
Same with my girlfriend.
yeah,
Yeah.
it's
It's
a
dark.
bunch of special.
I'm sorry, by the way.
Yeah. And well, I mean, that same, it's just like moving the
You
authoritarian
have to think
structure into
about-
home, though,
You have
right?
to think about personality. Like, let's go back to like the big five and the way that just individual
Sure.
personality differences have. Right, you have differences on the openness dimension.
Yeah.
People that are really high in openness don't want authoritarian structures. People really low in openness do.
That's a good point.
You know?
And
But I do think there's an environmental factor there.
Yes.
Whereas, you know,
That's
if you
what I was
have whether you are raised in a fundamentalist community or you go to an authoritarian school system, that's going to create, you know, a predisposition in the population towards those traits. Whereas, you know, if you have, you know, strong, open, democratic institutions and education system and all that, it's going to facilitate it more leaning in the other direction.
I just think that because every time we tried that, they lean towards authoritarian, that we're not addressing the fact that there is an implicit desire in humanity.
I do think
to
there
seek
is.
authoritarian.
Yeah.
I think you're right as well. And that's definitely something that we should, you know, acknowledge. And,
And
try
that's
to do
why-
So
something.
we have
Absolutely.
to acknowledge it to stop it.
Yeah,
Absolutely.
exactly.
And I think even within this model, there's still some of that because you're still electing leaders.
Yeah.
You know, at least they're accountable to you. But that's different than like the workers are getting together around a round table to vote on each decision every day. You know, they're going, okay, we like what you're saying, give it a shot. And if we don't like what happens, we'll put someone else there. So don't fuck up.
Yeah. It'd be interesting too to get into the, I guess the power checks with that, because like the president, I mean that's
Right.
the basic idea of what we have now is that
Right.
we elect somebody, but we've gotten to the point
Yeah.
where the system's so cohesive
Yeah.
that we can't really do anything when somebody shitty gets elected.
I haven't come to some firm decisions on that in terms of how I feel about checks within the system. Because I mean, like, what if the person you've elected management literally tries to infringe on the rights of democratic?
Yeah.
So I guess you just have to make it so the management just doesn't, kind of like a constitutional system where like, okay, you can't take our democratic rights within the system, even if you're exercising your power to do a bunch of other stuff.
There's
Yeah.
lots of tiny Americas everywhere.
Yeah. Well, I like the
Yeah.
idea of the diversity
I mean,
of
it
it
I'm
makes
too.
okay with that, really.
Because like
to
it
be
makes sense
honest.
because we do have a big problem with just the population growth. The system worked
Yeah.
better when there were way less people and like there were more local, like local governments were tighter
Yeah.
and everything. You know, the idea that states' rights and that government was more local in that
Yeah.
sense
For sure,
too.
yeah.
Now it's just 330 million people. Let's go. Like,
Booyah.
And to be honest, you also get. I mean, we can think of it even like graphically because I think like it's a really cool way. But it's like if you just like if you have a bunch of huge ass circles, like let's say all of like the mainland of the United States had 6 circles of like kind of like political orientation, and it's like you have like super democratic people on the west side and super conservative people on the right side. It's like even if you try to get like a like a middle color of white, like that's basically all you get. You get like that polarization where you have like a lot of blue on this side, a lot of red on this side, and kind of like a neutral here.
Yeah.
But if you separate those into smaller and smaller and smaller and smaller and smaller circles, you can get a better gradation and more interaction that way of like, oh, okay, maybe like there's more. It can become more dynamic, I guess. Is that idea? There's smaller data points.
Also, I would also like to point out that there's a lot of uniformity in terms of the way our business is structured in the current economy. Like, people go into management and they reference kind of the idea of how it's done, which is kind of like well hammered out now. I would be so excited to see the kinds of experimentation and diversification of business structures if you're giving workers in each business.
Stuff, they do have a lot. I mean, you can go into different models and stuff with that.
Yeah.
I mean, there are different management philosophies. There's definitely a more. So we're actually kind of in the middle of trying to transition from a more old school philosophy to a new school, and
Good.
Yeah, like if you go to a lot of like companies that have been around for longer, that are like, they're set in their ways. Like not Google. Like Google's got the like newer philosophy of like a more democratic system. Like it's less, pyramid shaped. There's a lot flatter based. People aren't like in such clearly defined roles, as to where the more like tight hierarchy is like considered the like old school management
Definitely.
style.
So it's getting better.
Yeah, most people, like if you go to business school, will advocate moving away from that. That's sort of seen as like the old school like business farts are still trying to keep that away around.
And this is definitely part of my own hopes and idealism, but I mean I would hope to see manifesting kind of a transition from capitalism to democratic businesses taking place slowly, kind of like capitalism emerging from feudalism. Because I'm studying that a lot right now, is like the whole Enlightenment and how slow and just varied that process was.
Right, yeah.
Until, some of the kings got sold on it, and then they made it happen really quickly.
Yeah, that happens with like everything, just like Christianity and the Roman Empire, right?
Yeah, exactly. Constantine and all that. Yeah.
It's kind of that idea. I forget what like the best example of it is, but like when it flips.
It's pretty funny because the most capitalist,
the tipping point, sure.
The most capitalist-friendly monarch in Enlightenment Europe was Louis. Was the French king. He had an advisor that was like really into capitalism, and Adam Smith? Yeah, Adam Smith and all that. And so they start pushing all this stuff to like, government stop, setting the price of bread and all this different stuff. And it would lead to the kind of social pressures that would lead to the French Revolution, which ironically, the goal succeeded. Capitalism emerged out of the French Revolution and replaced the royalty with the business class. So it was a trip. It's a trip.
That is a trip.
Lost his head.
We should talk more about the French Revolution and other times in history next time.
Oh yeah, I'm still got a lot to learn on that.
I like looking through that lens and trying.
I can talk with authority on ancient Greece. Everything else, there's lots to learn still.
Sure.
You guys should talk about especially like big transitional periods.
That's why I'm so interested in that right now. That's my. The Industrial Revolution's another one that I'm starting to, but right now I'm focused on Enlightenment.
That's cool.
Excellent. That was good though. I appreciate.
Yeah, thanks for coming by, Chris. That was awesome.
Yeah, that's fun.
That was good. Good debates.
Yeah. Let's cut this shit out. So. There's your
Good
time.
timing.
I mean, Benjamin Franklin was an alien.
Benjamin.
Pretty much made sure that
Yeah,
the
definitely
French
an alien.
Revolution
Benjamin. I love Benjamin Franklin.
Those are facts.